Welcome, true believers, to a journey into the heart of what it means to live two lives at once. Tonight, we're going to explore the complete story of Peter Parker's double existence, the delicate balance between ordinary teenager and extraordinary hero, between homework and heroism, between the mask and the face beneath it. This is a story about secrets and sacrifices, about the weight of responsibility carried in silence, and the constant struggle to protect the people you love while hiding the very thing that makes you special. If you're enjoying this gentle journey through Peter's story and want to continue exploring the complete saga of how a high school outcast became a wall-crawling hero, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us create more of these sleep-friendly deep dives into the stories that have captured our imaginations for generations. So settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind wander through the hidden corridors of a life split between two worlds. We'll move gently through each transition, each choice, each moment when Peter had to decide which version of himself to be. There's no rush here, no need to remember every detail or every name. Just let the story carry you like a web line through the night, swinging between the bright public world and the secret shadows where heroes are made. Our story is one of constant transformation, of a boy learning to be two people at once and discovering that the hardest part of having great power isn't using it, it's hiding it from everyone you care about. The halls of Midtown High School in 1962 echo with the familiar sounds of teenage life. Lockers slamming, laughter bouncing off tile walls, the shuffling of feet between classes creating a rhythm that marks the passage of ordinary days. In these corridors, where social hierarchies are as rigid as any caste system, and popularity is currency more valuable than gold, there exists a particular kind of invisibility reserved for those who are too smart for their own good and too awkward to hide it. Peter Benjamin Parker moves through these spaces like a ghost, present but unseen, noticed only when someone needs homework answers or when Flash Thompson requires a target for his daily dose of casual cruelty. He's 15 years old, though his slight build and perpetually serious expression make him seem somehow both younger and older than his years, as if he's simultaneously lost in childhood wonder and already burdened by adult concerns. The Parker household on Ingram Street in Forest Hills, Queens, sits modest and unassuming among its neighbours, a small single-family home with white siding and a covered porch where Uncle Ben likes to sit on summer evenings, reading the newspaper and waving to passers-by. The house itself tells the story of a family that has learned to find richness in simplicity, where love and values matter more than material possessions, where a well-maintained garden and a tidy workshop speak to the dignity of honest work and careful attention to the things that truly matter. Inside, the walls are covered with photographs documenting Peter's life from infancy through his current teenage years, each image capturing a moment of growth and change, though the expression in his eyes remains remarkably consistent across the years, that same thoughtful, slightly distant gaze that suggests a mind always working, always wondering, always seeking to understand the world around him. Aunt May Parker tends to her home and her nephew with the same gentle thoroughness she brings to her garden, where roses bloom in careful rows and vegetables grow in the backyard plot that provides fresh produce for their table. She's a woman of modest means but enormous heart, someone who has known loss and hardship but has chosen to respond with kindness rather than bitterness, with generosity rather than self-protection. Her love for Peter is absolute and uncomplicated, untainted by the complexities that sometimes come with parental relationships, because she has chosen this role rather than being born into it, and that choice makes all the difference. She worries about Peter constantly, about his social isolation, his tendency toward introspection, the way he seems to carry the weight of the world on his thin shoulders, even though he's just a boy who should be thinking about sports and dances and all the carefree things that teenagers are supposed to enjoy. Uncle Ben Parker works various jobs to keep the family afloat, never complaining about the long hours or the physical toll that manual labour takes on a body that's no longer young. He's a man of quiet strength and simple wisdom, someone who believes that character is built through small daily choices rather than grand dramatic gestures, that integrity matters more in how you treat the grocery store clerk than in how you respond to life-changing crises. Waste offends his Depression era sensibilities, tools organised in a system that makes sense only to him, but represents decades of accumulated knowledge about how things work and how they can be fixed. When he talks to Peter, which he does often and with genuine interest, he listens more than he speaks, asking questions that encourage his nephew to think deeply about the choices he's making and the person he's becoming. Peter's bedroom is a sanctuary from the harsh realities of high school social life, a space where he can be fully himself without fear of judgment or mockery. The walls are covered with periodic tables and diagrams of molecular structures, photographs of scientists who changed the world through the power of their minds rather than the strength of their bodies. His desk is perpetually covered with textbooks and notebooks, with chemistry sets and partially completed experiments that he pursues in his spare time, driven by a curiosity that can't be satisfied by the limited curriculum of his high school classes. He reads voraciously, everything from science fiction to scientific journals, from biographies of great inventors to comic books that let him imagine worlds where the awkward and overlooked might discover they have special destinies waiting for them. Late at night, when May and Ben are sleeping, Peter lies in his bed and stares at the ceiling, wondering if this is all there is, if he's destined to spend his entire life being invisible, being the brain that everyone uses but nobody really sees. At Midtown High, Peter's academic excellence is both his greatest asset and his heaviest burden, because while his teachers praise his intelligence and his potential, his classmates view his achievements with a mixture of resentment and dismissive contempt. He is the curve breaker, the teacher's pet, the walking calculator who makes everyone else look bad by comparison, and high school society has no tolerance for those who make others feel inadequate simply by being themselves. Flash Thompson, tall and athletic and confident in the way that comes from never having been told no, has made Peter his special project, a daily reminder to the entire student body of where the real power lies. The bullying is rarely physical, because Flash isn't cruel in that particular way, but the psychological impact of constant mockery, of being shoved into lockers or tripped in hallways while laughter follows in waves, creates wounds that run deeper than bruises and last longer than any physical injury. The other students flow around Peter like water around a stone, acknowledging his presence only when absolutely necessary, moving in their own currents of friendship and romance and social drama, while he remains stationary and alone. He watches them from his position on the periphery, studying their interactions with the same analytical attention he brings to his science experiments, trying to understand the invisible rules that govern social acceptance and belonging. There are moments when he catches glimpses of kindness, when someone smiles at him in the hallway or includes him in a group project with genuine friendliness rather than resigned obligation. And these small instances of human warmth sustain him through the longer stretches of isolation and exclusion. He tells himself that high school won't last forever, that college will be different, that someday his intelligence will be valued rather than resented. But the daily reality of invisibility makes those future possibilities feel very distant and uncertain. Peter's lunch periods are spent in the library, where he can lose himself in books and avoid the social minefield of the cafeteria, where seating arrangements reveal the complex hierarchies of teenage life and sitting alone marks you as fundamentally different, fundamentally other, the librarian misses. Chen has developed a soft spot for this quiet boy who treats books with reverence and always returns them in better condition than he found them, and she sometimes recommends titles she thinks he might enjoy, creating a silent conspiracy of mutual respect between two people who understand that knowledge is its own reward, regardless of what the popular crowd might think. In these quiet hours surrounded by books, Peter feels most himself, most at peace, because here intelligence is celebrated rather than mocked. because here he can travel to other worlds and other times where maybe, just maybe, someone like him might be the hero of the story rather than its invisible narrator. The scientific world of 1962 pulses with possibility and promise, with the atomic age offering visions of clean energy and miracle cures, with the space race inspiring young people to dream of touching the stars. Peter absorbs all of this with the hungry enthusiasm of someone who believes that science can make the world better, that human ingenuity can solve any problem if given enough time and resources and freedom to explore. He saves his allowance to buy magazines about the latest technological developments, cutting out articles about breakthrough discoveries and taping them to his walls like other boys might display posters of sports heroes or musicians. In his imagination, he sees himself someday contributing to this great march of progress, maybe discovering a new element or developing a cure for some terrible disease, using his mind to help people in ways that his body and his social status currently prevent. Uncle Ben watches Peter's isolation with a father's concern and a wise man's patience, knowing that some lessons can't be taught but must be learned through experience, that some kinds of strength only develop when tested by adversity. He tries to provide guidance without being overbearing, offering observations about life and character that he hopes will take root in Peter's mind and grow into wisdom over time. The measure of a man, he tells Peter one evening while they're working together in the basement workshop, fixing a neighbour's broken chair, isn't in how strong he is or how popular he is, but in what he chooses to do when he has the power to choose. That's when you see what someone is really made of. When they have options and they pick the harder right over the easier wrong. Peter nods, only half understanding at the time, focused more on the woodwork than the philosophy. But the words settle into his mind like seeds waiting for the right conditions to germinate. Aunt May's approach to Peter's struggles is more immediate and practical, expressed through extra helpings at dinner and gentle encouragement about his appearance and social prospects. She believes, with the optimism of someone who has chosen hope over cynicism, that Peter's goodness and intelligence will eventually be recognized and rewarded, that the world is fundamentally fair even if it doesn't always seem that way in the moment. She tells him stories about his parents, Richard and Mary Parker, painting pictures of their courage and kindness, their dedication to helping others, their belief that every person has the responsibility to use their gifts in service of the greater good. These stories are meant to comfort and inspire, to give Peter a sense of connection to people he barely remembers, but they also create a kind of pressure, an unspoken expectation that he should live up to a legacy he never asked for and can't fully understand. The weight of ordinariness sits heavy on Peter's shoulders during this period of his life, the sense that he is destined for a small existence in a small corner of the world, that his dreams of significance and contribution are just the fantasies of a lonely boy trying to make himself feel special. He looks at his reflection in the bathroom mirror and sees someone unremarkable, someone who will grow up to be a good person, maybe, a decent person, certainly, but not someone who changes anything or matters to anyone beyond the small circle of people obligated to care about him. The glasses perched on his nose seem to symbolize everything that holds him back, a physical reminder of weakness and difference, of the ways his body fails to match the capabilities of his mind. He dreams sometimes of being different, of being strong or confident or socially adept, of walking into school one day and having people actually see him, actually notice that he exists and has value beyond his ability to help them pass their chemistry tests. But for now, in these final months before everything changes, Peter Parker remains invisible, moving through the halls of Midtown High like a ghost, sitting at the dinner table with May and Ben, and feeling grateful for their love even as he wonders if this small warm kitchen represents the boundaries of his entire world. He does his homework with meticulous care. He helps Aunt May with the grocery shopping. He listens to Uncle Ben's stories and advice with patient attention. He endures Flash Thompson's bullying with silent resignation, and he dreams his private dreams of someday, somehow, mattering to someone beyond the walls of this small house in Queens. The radioactive spider that will change everything is already living in its enclosure at the science demonstration, already carrying in its DNA the power to transform an invisible boy into something extraordinary. But Peter doesn't know this yet, and so he continues in his ordinary life, unaware that the universe is preparing to answer his unspoken prayers in ways he could never have imagined and would never have chosen if given the chance to understand the true cost of becoming visible, of becoming special, of becoming someone who matters. The science demonstration that will change Peter Parker's life forever takes place on a Tuesday afternoon in November, when the autumn light slants through the tall windows of the university lecture hall, and the air carries that particular crispness that makes everything feel sharp and clear and full of possibility. Peter's science class has been granted permission to attend this special presentation on the peaceful applications of radioactive research, an opportunity that most of his classmates view with the resigned boredom of teenagers forced to endure yet another educational experience when they'd rather be anywhere else. But for Peter, this field trip represents a rare moment of pure joy, a chance to witness cutting-edge science in action, to see the kind of work that he dreams of contributing to someday when he's finally free from the social prison of high school and can devote himself fully to the pursuit of knowledge and discovery. The lecture hall itself is an impressive space, one of those grand old university rooms with wooden seats arranged in steep tiers, creating an amphitheatre effect that makes the demonstration area feel like a stage where the great drama of scientific progress plays itself out before an audience of the initiated and the curious. Dr. Curtis Connors stands at the front of the room, a brilliant researcher whose work with radioactive isotopes has positioned him at the forefront of his field, though the empty sleeve pinned to his white lab coat tells the story of a wartime sacrifice that gives his research a personal urgency that goes beyond mere academic interest. He speaks with passionate enthusiasm about the potential of controlled radiation to treat diseases and transform materials, to unlock secrets of cellular biology, and create new compounds that could revolutionize medicine and industry, his voice carrying that particular intensity that comes from someone who has dedicated his entire life to understanding a single profound question. Behind Dr. Connors, various experiments showcase the power and promise of atomic energy, all carefully contained within lead-lined chambers and protective barriers that demonstrate both the incredible potential and the necessary caution required when working with forces that can both heal and harm. There are plants growing at accelerated rates under controlled radioactive exposure, their stems thick and their leaves unnaturally large, proof of concept for agricultural applications that might someday feed a hungry world. There are samples of metals that have been transformed at the molecular level, taking on properties of strength and flexibility that their natural states could never achieve, suggesting possibilities for construction and manufacturing that could reshape the physical infrastructure of civilization itself. And there, in a small glass enclosure that seems almost afterthought in its positioning among the more dramatic displays, sits a spider no larger than a pencil eraser, its body glowing with a faint luminescence that speaks to the radioactive exposure that has altered its cellular structure in ways that even Dr. Connors doesn't fully understand or anticipate. Peter sits in the middle of the lecture hall, leaning forward in his seat with an attention and focus that stands in stark contrast to the fidgeting and whispering of his classmates around him. His notebook is open on the desk before him, already filling with observations and questions, with sketches of the experimental setups and notes about the underlying principles that Dr. Connors is explaining. This is Peter in his element, fully engaged and fully present. His usual social anxiety and self-consciousness temporarily forgotten in the pure pleasure of learning, of expanding his understanding, of glimpsing the frontiers of human knowledge and imagining himself someday working in spaces like this, contributing to the great collective project of understanding and improving the world. He doesn't notice Flash Thompson making faces at him from 3 rows back, doesn't hear the snickering that follows, because for this brief window of time, He exists entirely in the world of ideas and possibilities that the demonstration represents. Dr. Connors is explaining the careful safety protocols that prevent dangerous exposure when something goes wrong with the small spider's enclosure, some failure of the seal, or some defect in the construction that allows the radioactive arachnid to begin lowering itself on an invisible thread of silk, descending from its designated space into the open air of the lecture hall. The spider itself seems unremarkable despite its faint glow. Just an ordinary garden spider of the kind that Peter has seen thousands of times in Aunt May's backyard, spinning webs between the tomato plants and catching the small insects that threaten her carefully tended vegetables. But this spider has been transformed at a fundamental level, its DNA rewritten by exposure to radioactive energy in ways that make it something entirely new. Unnoticed by Dr. Connors, who is unnoticed by Dr. Connors, who is focused on his explanation of isotope decay rates, and unnoticed by most of the students, who are focused on anything except the scientific concepts being presented. But the spider continues its invisible journey downward, drawn by some instinct or random chance toward the rows of seated students, toward the boy in the middle of the room who sits with his hand resting on his desk, palm up, fingers slightly curled, providing a perfect landing spot for a small creature looking for a place to rest. The thread of silk catches the light just once as it passes through a sunbeam, creating a momentary shimmer that Peter's eye catches in his peripheral vision, causing him to glance down just as the spider makes contact with the back of his right hand. The bite itself is sharp and immediate, a sudden burning pain that makes Peter inhale quickly and jerk his hand away, looking down to see the small glowing spider embedded in his skin. Its fangs delivering venom that is unlike any spider venom that has existed before, carrying with it the radioactive alterations that have transformed the creature's entire biological system. The pain radiates outward from the bite site with shocking intensity, far worse than any normal spider bite should be, a heat that seems to travel through his veins and spread throughout his body with each beat of his suddenly racing heart. Peter brushes the spider away with his other hand, watching as it falls to the floor and curls up, apparently dying from the effort of delivering its radioactive payload, its glow fading as its small body goes still. For a moment, Peter considers calling out, alerting Dr. Connors to what has just happened, seeking medical attention for what might be a serious exposure to radioactive material. But the embarrassment of disrupting the demonstration, of drawing attention to himself in front of his entire class, of being the kid who got bitten by a spider and made a fuss about it, keeps him silent. He tells himself that it's probably nothing, that the spider's radioactivity was contained and controlled, that the burning sensation he feels spreading through his arm is just his imagination, or a normal reaction to any spider bite. He presses his left hand over the bite site, trying to contain the heat and the pain, trying to maintain his composure and his attention on Dr. Connor's explanation, even though his vision is beginning to blur slightly and sweat is beading on his forehead despite the cool temperature of the lecture hall. The rest of the demonstration passes in a kind of fog for Peter. As the radioactive venom works its way through his system and begins the process of transformation that will rewrite his DNA and alter his physiology in ways that go far beyond anything that medical science of 1962 could understand or predict. He manages to take a few more notes, though his handwriting becomes increasingly shaky and illegible, managed to nod and smile when Dr. Connors asks if there are any questions, though the words seem to come from very far away. Filtered through layers of cotton and distance, his classmates begin filing out of the lecture hall when the presentation concludes, their chatter and laughter echoing off the high ceiling, and Peter follows them on unsteady legs, grateful for the crowd that hides his condition, grateful that no one is paying enough attention to notice that something is very wrong. The walk home from school becomes an ordeal that Peter will later remember only in fragments and disconnected images. He recalls stopping to lean against a lamppost, his vision swimming and his stomach churning with nausea that threatens to overwhelm him. He recalls the concerned face of an elderly woman asking if he needs help, and his own voice, sounding strange and distant, assuring her that he's fine. Just a touch of flu. Nothing to worry about. He recalls the familiar streets of Forest Hill seeming somehow different, the colours too bright and the sounds too loud, his senses overwhelmed by stimulation that his brain struggles to process and organise into coherent perception. By the time he reaches the front steps of the house on Ingram Street, Peter is barely able to maintain his balance, his body shaking with alternating chills and fever, his skin clammy with sweat, his heart racing at a pace that feels dangerous and unsustainable. Aunt May takes one look at Peter's pale face and glassy eyes, and immediately shifts into caretaker mode, helping him up the stairs to his bedroom with gentle hands and soothing words, attributing his condition to a flu bug that must be going around, or perhaps exhaustion from too many late nights studying for upcoming tests. She brings him aspirin and water, brings him soup that he's too nauseous to eat, brings him extra blankets when he shivers with chills and removes them when he kicks them off in the grip of fever. Uncle Ben appears in the doorway of Peter's room periodically throughout the afternoon and evening, his weathered face creased with concern, offering quiet encouragement and the assurance that whatever bug Peter has caught will pass soon enough, that youth and good health will see him through this temporary setback. But what's happening to Peter is far from temporary and far from ordinary. As night falls and the house grows quiet as Aunt May and Uncle Ben retire to their own room, trusting that sleep and rest will restore their nephew to health, Peter's body undergoes changes that would terrify him if he were conscious enough to understand them. The radioactive spider venom is rewriting his genetic code, altering his DNA to incorporate characteristics that have never before existed in human biology, creating something entirely new. Something that falls between the categories of human and spider. Something that possesses capabilities that seem to violate the known laws of physics and biology. His muscles are being restructured at the cellular level, becoming denser and more efficient, capable of generating force far beyond what his size and weight should allow. His skeletal system is being reinforced, the bones becoming stronger and more flexible, able to withstand impacts and pressures that would shatter normal human bone. His nervous system is developing new pathways and capabilities, creating a kind of early warning system that will eventually be able to sense danger before it becomes visible or audible, a precognitive awareness that defies rational explanation but will prove essential to his survival in the dangerous life that awaits him. The dreams that fill Peter's fevered sleep are strange and disturbing, filled with images of webs and walls, of crawling and climbing in ways that human beings aren't designed to move. He dreams of seeing the world from impossible angles, of hanging upside down from ceilings and walking up vertical surfaces as easily as walking on level ground. He dreams of strength that could bend metal and speed that could blur his movements beyond normal perception. He dreams of sensing things that haven't happened yet, of knowing that danger is approaching before it arrives, of being connected to his environment in ways that make the boundary between self and world seem permeable and uncertain. The dreams are vivid and intense, more real than ordinary dreams, because they're not entirely dreams at all, but rather his unconscious mind processing and trying to make sense of the fundamental changes taking place in his body and brain. When morning light finally filters through Peter's bedroom window, gentle and golden with the promise of a new day, he wakes slowly, reluctantly, climbing up from depths of sleep that felt more like drowning than resting. For a long moment he lies still, taking inventory of his body and trying to understand why everything feels different, why the familiar sensations of being in his own skin seem somehow strange and new. The fever has broken, leaving him feeling weak but clear-headed, exhausted but alert in a way that makes the room around him seem unnaturally vivid and detailed. He can see individual dust motes floating in the shaft of sunlight, can hear Aunt May moving around in the kitchen 2 floors below with a clarity that shouldn't be possible, can feel the texture of his sheets against his skin with an intensity that borders on overwhelming. Sitting up carefully, Peter reaches for his glasses on the nightstand, the automatic gesture of someone who has been nearsighted since childhood, but when he puts them on, the world becomes blurry and distorted rather than clear. Confused, he removes the glasses and discovers that his vision is perfect, better than perfect actually, sharp and clear across his entire field of view, able to focus instantly on objects near and far without the adjustment period that normal eyes require. The realization sends a jolt of excitement and fear through him in equal measure, because while the improved vision is undeniably wonderful, it's also impossible. A change that shouldn't be able to happen overnight, that suggests something fundamental has altered in his body. Testing cautiously, Peter swings his legs out of bed and stands, immediately noticing differences in his balance and coordination, a kind of effortless grace that his normally awkward body has never possessed. He feels lighter somehow, as if gravity has loosened its hold on him, as if he could jump or leap with a power and precision that his old body would never have allowed. Moving to his desk, he picks up a pencil and is shocked by how fragile it feels in his grip, how easy it would be to snap it in half or crush it entirely. He sets it down carefully and looks at his hands, which appear unchanged on the surface, but which he can feel are different, stronger, capable of things that make no sense but that he somehow knows with absolute certainty. The moment of true discovery comes when Peter, still trying to understand what's happening to him, places his palm flat against the wall beside his desk, intending simply to lean against it while he processes this strange new reality. He tries to pull away. He has to. He tries to pull away. He has to consciously think about releasing, about turning off whatever biological mechanism is creating this adhesion, and his hand comes free with a sensation that he will later describe as being similar to unsticking tape. Tentatively, hardly daring to believe what his instincts are telling him, Peter places both hands against the wall and finds that he can support his weight, that he can actually climb up the vertical surface as easily as walking upstairs, his hands and feet finding purchase where no purchase should exist. The scientific part of Peter's mind, even in his state of shock and wonder, begins trying to formulate explanations, thinking about van der Waals forces and the way that gecko feet create molecular bonds with surfaces, thinking about how spider legs use hydraulic pressure and microscopic hairs to achieve their climbing ability. But the more immediate visceral part of his consciousness is simply overwhelmed by the sheer impossibility and the undeniable reality of what's happening to him. He climbs up to his ceiling and hangs there, upside down, his heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilaration, looking down at his bedroom from an angle that human beings are never meant to experience except in dreams or nightmares. The hours that Peter spends exploring his new abilities in the privacy of his bedroom become a kind of secret education, a personal science experiment conducted with equal parts wonder and caution. He discovers that the strength flowing through his transformed muscles is remarkable, not just in its magnitude but in its precision. That he can regulate his grip with perfect control, crushing objects when he wants to or handling delicate things with a gentleness that his old clumsy hands could never have achieved. The wall-crawling ability proves to be both instinctive and deliberate, requiring him to consciously engage and disengage the adhesion, but feeling as natural as breathing once he understands how to control it. And there's something else, something harder to define or understand. A kind of tingling sensation at the base of his skull that seems to flare up moments before anything potentially dangerous happens, as if his body has developed a built-in warning system for threats that haven't yet materialized. The practical implications of these abilities occupy Peter's thoughts as he lies in bed that night, pretending to sleep when Aunt May checks on him, his mind racing through possibilities and questions that seem to multiply faster than he can process them. The improved vision means he won't need glasses anymore, which is a blessing that will simplify his life in small but meaningful ways, though explaining the sudden recovery to Aunt May will require careful thought and creative storytelling. The strength and agility could change everything about his daily existence, could make him formidable in ways that would protect him from Flash Thompson's bullying and earn him respect from classmates who have always viewed him as weak and vulnerable. But the wall-crawling ability, the sheer strangeness and impossibility of it, suggests that what's happened to him goes far beyond simple physical enhancement into territory that he can barely comprehend, territory that raises questions about what he's become and what responsibilities might come with these inexplicable gifts. The decision to test his abilities outside the confines of his bedroom comes gradually, building over several days as Peter grows more confident in his control and more curious about his limits. He begins staying after school, using the excuse of studying in the library to give himself time alone in the empty building, where he can practice climbing walls and leaping between stairwells without witnesses who might ask uncomfortable questions. He discovers that he can jump from the second-floor landing and land softly, absorbing the impact with knees that bend in ways that should be impossible, that defy the normal constraints of human anatomy and physics. He finds that he can run faster than he ever imagined, his legs carrying him with a speed and endurance that make his previous attempts at physical education class seem pathetic by comparison. The advertisement that changes everything appears in the back pages of the newspaper that Uncle Ben brings home one evening in early December, a small notice that most people would skip over without a second thought. Wrestling match at the Civic Arena, it announces in bold letters, promising $100 to anyone who can last 3 minutes in the ring with professional wrestler Joseph Crusher Hogan. The amount is staggering to Peter, who has grown up understanding the value of every dollar in a household where money is always tight and luxuries are rare and carefully considered. $100 could buy the microscope he's been wanting, could help Aunt May with the household expenses, could provide a cushion of security for a family that lives paycheck to paycheck and worries constantly about unexpected bills or emergency repairs. But more than the money, the wrestling match represents an opportunity to test himself, to discover what he's truly capable of in a controlled environment where his abilities won't seem quite so impossible, because the audience will assume that any extraordinary feats are just part of the theatrical spectacle that professional wrestling provides. The idea takes root in Peter's mind and grows quickly, fed by his teenage desire to prove himself, by his curiosity about his own limits, and by the seductive possibility that maybe, just maybe, these strange abilities could be useful for something more than climbing walls in empty school hallways. He tells himself that it's a one-time thing, a simple experiment, a way to earn some money and satisfy his curiosity without any long-term implications or commitments. The costume that Peter creates for his wrestling debut is hastily assembled and far from the sleek outfit that he'll eventually develop, cobbled together from items found in his closet and Aunt May's sewing supplies. He takes an old red sweatshirt and draws a crude spiderweb pattern on it with black marker. The lines uneven and the design more childish than intimidating, but sufficient for his purposes. A pair of blue sweatpants serves as the bottom half of the costume, and a ski mask with eye holes cut larger provides anonymity without requiring any sophisticated disguise. The overall effect is amateur and slightly ridiculous, something that would make him a laughingstock if anyone from school saw him. But it will serve its purpose for a single wrestling match where no one will know his real identity or connect this masked figure to the invisible Peter Parker who haunts the halls of Midtown High. Sneaking out of the house requires careful planning and execution, waiting until Uncle Ben and Aunt May are deeply asleep, easing his window open without making the old frame creak. Climbing down the outside wall of the house with his new abilities, making the descent trivially easy. The walk to the Civic Arena feels longer than the actual distance, every block increasing Peter's nervousness, and his sense that he's crossing a threshold that will be difficult to uncross, that by choosing to use his abilities publicly, even in the anonymous context of a wrestling match. He's making a decision that will change the trajectory of his life in ways he can't fully anticipate or control. The arena itself is everything Peter expected, and nothing he's prepared for. A world of bright lights and loud voices, of cigarette smoke hanging thick in the air, and the smell of cheap beer and sweat, creating an atmosphere that's both exciting and slightly nauseating. The crowd is rough and working class, people who have come for entertainment that's more spectacle than sport, who want to see someone get hurt or humiliated, who thrive on the drama of competition and the vicarious thrill of watching physical conflict from the safety of their seats. The other challengers who have signed up to face Crusher Hogan are mostly young men who don't understand what they're getting into, who think their toughness or their amateur boxing experience will somehow translate to success against a professional who has spent years perfecting the art of controlled violence that wrestling represents. When Peter signs up under the name Spider-Man, chosen on impulse because he needs to call himself something, and the spider bite seems like the obvious inspiration, the promoter looks at his slight build and homemade costume with barely concealed amusement. The man assumes that this skinny kid will provide some comic relief before getting destroyed by Crusher Hogan, that the audience will enjoy watching someone so obviously outmatched try and fail to earn the prize money. Peter can feel the condescension in the promoter's attitude, can see the dismissive glances from the other challengers who size him up and dismiss him as irrelevant, and the familiar sting of being underestimated and overlooked fuels his determination to prove them all wrong, to show them that appearances can be deceiving and that the invisible boy they're mocking possesses capabilities that would shock them if they truly understood. The wait before his match feels eternal, sitting in the dingy dressing area and listening to the muffled roar of the crowd, hearing the announcements and the impacts of bodies hitting the ring, watching the other challengers return defeated and sometimes injured, nursing bruises and wounded pride. Peter's nervousness builds with each passing minute, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusts his mask and checks that his costume is secure, his mind running through scenarios and strategies, even though he has no real plan beyond trying to stay in the ring for 3 minutes and hoping that his enhanced abilities will be enough to accomplish that seemingly simple goal. When his turn finally comes and his name is announced to the crowd, Peter walks toward the ring on legs that feel disconnected from his body, hearing the laughter and jeers that greet his appearance, the catcalls and mocking comments about his homemade costume and his obvious lack of professional training. Crusher Hogan waits in the centre of the ring, a mountain of a man with massive arms and a scarred face, looking at Peter with an expression that mixes pity and professional disinterest, clearly expecting this to be the easiest $100 he's kept all night. The referee explains the rules such as they are, and starts the timer that will count down the 3 minutes that stand between Peter and the prize money he's risked so much to pursue. What happens next becomes the first public demonstration of Spider-Man's abilities, though the audience interprets what they see through the lens of professional wrestling theatrics, rather than recognizing it as the genuine superhuman feat that it actually represents. Crusher Hogan lunges forward with the confidence of someone who has done this hundreds of times before, expecting to grab the skinny kid and throw him around the ring like a rag doll. But Peter's enhanced reflexes and his new warning sense allow him to dodge with ease, slipping aside at the last possible moment and leaving Hogan grasping at empty air. The crowd's laughter turns to surprised murmurs as Peter continues to evade every attack, moving with a grace and speed that seems impossible for someone with no training, ducking under wild swings and leaping over attempted tackles with the casual ease of someone performing a choreographed dance rather than fighting for survival. The moment when Peter decides to stop simply dodging and demonstrate his actual strength marks a turning point in the match and in his understanding of his own capabilities. Hogan charges again, and this time Peter doesn't move aside but instead plants his feet and catches the much larger man, absorbing the impact of several £100 of muscle, moving at full speed and stopping it completely, his enhanced strength making Hogan's mass feel manageable rather than overwhelming. lifts him off the ground entirely, holding the massive man above his head as if he weighs nothing at all, demonstrating strength that no normal teenager should possess, strength that violates everything the audience thinks they know about physics and human limitation. The crowd's reaction shifts from mockery to amazement, their voices rising in excitement and disbelief as Peter proceeds to outmaneuver and overpower Crusher Hogan, with an ease that makes the professional look amateurish by comparison. Peter sticks to the ropes of the ring when Hogan tries to corner him, his hands and feet adhering to the surface in ways that shouldn't be possible, allowing him to climb straight up and hang from the top rope while Hogan swings futilely below him. The 3-minute time limit comes and goes, with Peter still fresh and energetic while Hogan is winded and frustrated. Having failed completely to land a single effective blow against an opponent who seems to defy every conventional approach to wrestling or combat. The victory brings Peter more than just the $100 prize, though he clutches that money with trembling hands and profound gratitude, thinking of all the ways it will help his family and advance his own interests. The real prize is the attention, the applause, the experience of being seen and appreciated rather than ignored and mocked. For the first time in his life, Peter Parker is the center of positive attention, admired rather than dismissed, celebrated rather than bullied. The feeling is intoxicating, addictive, opening up possibilities that he had never seriously considered before this moment. The television producer who approaches Peter after the match introduces himself as a representative of a local variety show, explaining that they're always looking for unique acts to feature on their program, and that Spider-Man's performance tonight was exactly the kind of spectacular entertainment that audiences crave. The offer of a television appearance, with payment that dwarfs the wrestling prize money, presents Peter with a choice that will shape the direction of his immediate future. He could walk away now, take his $100 and return to his normal life, treating this as a one-time adventure that satisfied his curiosity and provided some much-needed money. Or he could continue down this path, could use his abilities to build a career as an entertainer, could finally escape the invisibility and poverty that have defined his existence for as long as he can remember. The decision Peter makes in this moment, standing in the back hallway of a wrestling arena with the sounds of the departing crowd echoing around him, sets in motion the chain of events that will lead to tragedy and transformation, that will teach him the hardest lesson of his young life about the relationship between power and responsibility. But right now, flushed with victory and dazzled by possibility, Peter sees only the opportunities that his abilities present, only the escape route they offer from a life of obscurity and struggle. He agrees to the television appearance, shaking the producer's hand and feeling like his life is finally beginning, like he's finally becoming someone who matters, someone who will be remembered, someone who has found a way to use his special gifts to create a better future for himself and for the people he loves. The television appearance that follows Peter's wrestling debut transforms him from anonymous amateur into minor celebrity, at least within the limited sphere of local entertainment television. The variety show that features Spider-Man presents him as a novelty act, something between a circus performer and a magician, someone whose abilities seem impossible but are accepted as part of the theatrical spectacle that defines this kind of programming. Hosts look clumsy and slow by comparison. The applause and laughter that greet his performance feed something deep inside Peter that has been starved for recognition his entire life, and the check he receives afterward represents more money than he's ever held in his hands. More money than Uncle Ben makes in several weeks of hard labour at his various jobs. The temptation to continue performing, to build on this initial success and create a sustainable income stream from his abilities, grows stronger with each passing day. Peter begins to imagine a future where he's no longer dependent on his aunt and uncle's limited resources, where he can contribute to the household expenses and maybe even help them achieve some of the small comforts that have always been just out of reach for a working-class family in Queens. He dreams of buying Aunt May a new washing machine to replace the ancient one that breaks down constantly, of getting Uncle Ben a proper set of tools instead of the mismatched collection he's accumulated over decades, of having enough money that the arrival of an unexpected bill doesn't create anxiety and careful calculations about what other expenses will need to be delayed or eliminated to accommodate this new demand on their strained budget. More television appearances follow as word spreads about the amazing Spider-Man and his impossible abilities, and with each performance Peter's confidence grows, along with his sense that he has finally found his calling, his way of being special and valued in a world that has spent 15 years teaching him that he doesn't matter except as a brain to be exploited for homework help. The money accumulates in a coffee can hidden in his closet, growing week by week into a sum that represents security and possibility, that makes Peter feel powerful in a way that goes beyond his enhanced strength and speed. Financial independence, even the modest version that his television earnings represent, changes the way he sees himself and his place in the world, making him feel less like a burden and more like a contributor, less like someone who needs help and more like someone who can provide it. The philosophy that develops in Peter's mind during these weeks of success is one of enlightened self-interest, a rational-sounding justification for focusing his abilities on personal gain rather than public service. He tells himself that he earned these powers through the accident of being bitten by that radioactive spider, that he owes nothing to anyone except the people who have actually cared for him, that the world which has been so cruel and dismissive toward Peter Parker deserves nothing from Spider-Man except whatever entertainment value his performances might provide to paying audiences. The idea that he might have some obligation to use his abilities to help strangers, to fight crime or protect innocent people seems absurd and romantic. The kind of naive thinking that belongs in the comic books he reads rather than in the real world, where everyone looks out for themselves and altruism is a luxury that only the already comfortable can afford. Uncle Ben's attempts to engage Peter in conversations about responsibility and character during this period are gentle and indirect, because he doesn't know about Spider-Man or the television appearances or the coffee can full of money hidden in Peter's closet. What Ben notices is that his nephew seems distracted and secretive, that he's staying out late more often and being evasive about where he's been and what he's been doing. The conversations that take place at the dinner table or in the basement workshop carry the weight of a father trying to guide a son through the complicated transition to adulthood, trying to instill values and principles that will serve as anchors when the temptations and pressures of the world threaten to pull someone away from their moral centre. "There's going to come a time, Pete," Uncle Ben says one evening while they're working together on a repair job for a neighbour, fixing a broken fence that the elderly woman next door can't afford to have professionally replaced, "when you're going to have a choice between doing what's easy and doing what's right. And that's when you'll find out who you really are, what you're really made of. Because anyone can do the right thing when it doesn't cost them anything, when it's convenient or when there's something in it for them. But real character, real integrity, that's what shows up when doing the right thing requires sacrifice, when it means giving up something you want or putting yourself at risk for someone else's benefit." Peter nods and makes appropriate responses, but his mind is elsewhere, calculating how many more television appearances he'll need to reach his savings goal, planning his next performance and thinking about the recognition and applause that await him. The night that everything changes begins like any other, with Peter leaving the television studio after a successful appearance, his pockets heavy with cash and his spirits high from another enthusiastic response from the studio audience. A commotion ahead, the sound of running a commotion ahead, the sound of running footsteps and a security guard's voice raised in alarm. Peter rounds the corner to see a thin man in a dark jacket sprinting down the hallway, clutching a canvas bag that presumably contains whatever he's stolen from the business office on the upper floor. Moving with the desperate speed of someone who knows that capture means prison time and the destruction of whatever life he's managed to build for himself, the security guard, an older man whose weathered face and slight limp speak to a life of hard work and accumulated small injuries, catches sight of Peter and immediately calls out for help. "Stop him," the guard shouts, his voice carrying that particular quality of someone who expects compliance from decent citizens, who believes that everyone has a basic obligation to help maintain social order and prevent criminal activity. "You've got those powers. You can catch him easy. Don't let him get away." The guard's assumption that Spider-Man will automatically assist in apprehending the thief is based on a reasonable belief that people with extraordinary abilities would naturally use them to help others, that power and goodness go hand in hand, that anyone who can help has an obligation to do so. For a moment that will haunt Peter for the rest of his life, he considers acting, considers using his enhanced speed to catch the fleeing thief, considers webbing him up or tackling him, or simply blocking his path to the elevator. His body is capable of stopping this crime with minimal effort. His abilities make him perfectly suited to intervene in exactly this kind of situation, and some part of him recognizes that the right thing to do, the good thing to do, would be to help this security guard who is just trying to do his job and protect his employer's property. But another part of Peter's mind, the part that has spent weeks being celebrated and paid for his performances, the part that has learned to think of his abilities as a personal asset rather than a public responsibility, quickly calculates the cost and benefit of getting involved. The television producer's words echo in Peter's memory, advice given after one of his early performances about the importance of maintaining his mystique and his marketability, about not cheapening his act by doing free work or getting involved in situations that might lead to injury or legal complications. "You're going to be a star, kid," the producer had said, his tone friendly but his message clear. "Don't waste your time on other people's problems. Focus on building your brand, on making money while you can, because fame is fleeting, and you need to cash in while people still care about what you can do." The philosophy made sense to Peter at the time, and it makes sense now, providing a rational-sounding justification for the decision that he's about to make. Peter steps aside and lets the thief run past him, watching with studied indifference as the man disappears into the elevator and the doors slide closed, carrying him to freedom and leaving the security guard standing in the hallway with an expression of disbelief and disgust. "What's wrong with you?" the older man demands, his voice thick with contempt and disappointment. "You could have stopped him easy. You've got all those powers. And you just let him go. What kind of person does that? What kind of person has the ability to help and just stands there and watches a criminal escape?" The questions hang in the air between them, accusatory and unanswerable, because Peter has no response that would make sense to someone who hasn't spent years being ignored and exploited, who doesn't understand that the world's indifference to Peter Parker has earned it Spider-Man's indifference in return. "I'm not a policeman," Peter says finally, his voice defensive and slightly sullen, echoing the producer's advice and his own evolving philosophy about the limits of his obligations to others. "I'm an entertainer. Catching criminals isn't my job, it's not what I do. I'm sorry he got away, but that's not my responsibility. That's what the police are for." The words sound reasonable to Peter as he speaks them, but they ring hollow in the empty hallway, and the security guard's expression of contempt and disappointment cuts deeper than Peter wants to admit. The old man shakes his head slowly, as if confronted with something incomprehensible and profoundly sad, and turns away without another word, leaving Peter standing alone with his choices and his justifications. The walk home feels different than Peter expects, less triumphant than it should given his successful performance and his pockets full of money. The security guard's words keep replaying in his mind that simple, devastating question about what kind of person has the ability to help and chooses not to. Made the right decision, that he's not made the right decision, that he's not responsible for solving every problem or stopping every crime, that he has his own life to live and his own goals to pursue, that the thief getting away has nothing to do with him and won't affect his life in any meaningful way. The rationalizations work well enough to let him sleep that night, though his dreams are troubled by images he can't quite remember when he wakes, shadows and sounds that leave him feeling vaguely uneasy without understanding why. The days that follow the thief's escape pass normally enough, with Peter attending school and performing his Spider-Man act and accumulating more money in the coffee can in his closet. Uncle Ben continues his gentle attempts to talk with Peter about responsibility and character, still unaware of the secret life his nephew is leading, but sensing somehow that important choices are being made and important lessons need to be learned. Aunt May continues her loving attention to Peter's well-being, worrying about his late nights and his distracted demeanour, attributing these changes to normal teenage development and the mysterious process by which boys become men. The household on Ingram Street maintains its rhythms and routines, a small safe space of love and stability in a world that often seems harsh and unforgiving. The phone call that shatters this normalcy comes on a Thursday evening in late December, when Peter is in his room working on homework and planning his next television appearance. He hears Aunt May answer the phone downstairs, hears her voice change from its usual warm greeting to something tight and frightened. Hears her calling for Uncle Ben with an urgency that sends Peter's new warning sense tingling, even though there's no immediate physical danger. He moves to the top of the stairs and listens as a police officer explains that there's been an incident at the warehouse where Ben works as a night security guard, that a burglar broke in, and when Ben tried to stop him, the criminal shot him. That Ben is being transported to the hospital, but the officer's tone suggests that Peter and May should prepare themselves for the worst possible news. The drive to the hospital passes in a blur of streetlights and silent prayers, with Aunt May clutching her purse and whispering to herself while Peter sits frozen in the back seat, his mind refusing to process what's happening, refusing to accept that Uncle Ben, who has never hurt anyone in his life, could be dying because some criminal valued stolen property more than human life. The emergency room waiting area is fluorescent bright and antiseptic clean, filled with other people facing their own crises, but none of them matter to Peter as he and May wait for the doctor who will tell them what they already know from the police officer's tone and the nurse's sympathetic expressions. Uncle Ben is dead, killed by a gunshot wound before the ambulance could get him to emergency surgery, gone from the world forever because he tried to do the right thing and stop a crime in progress. The grief that crashes over Peter is physical and overwhelming, doubling him over as if he's been punched in the stomach, making it hard to breathe as the reality of the loss floods through him. Uncle Ben, who taught him to ride a bicycle and helped him with his homework, who told terrible jokes at dinner and fixed broken things in the basement workshop, who believed in Peter's potential and tried to guide him toward becoming a good man, will never come home again. Will never sit on the front porch on summer evenings, will never offer another piece of gentle advice or express another moment of quiet pride in his nephew's achievements. The world without Uncle Ben seems impossible and wrong, a fundamental violation of the natural order, because Ben was supposed to be there, was supposed to see Peter graduate and go to college and build a life, was supposed to grow old and grey and live long enough to see that his efforts to raise a good person had succeeded. But beneath the grief, another emotion begins to build, hot and consuming and focused entirely on the man who pulled the trigger. Anger, pure and righteous and demanding action, fills the space where shock and disbelief briefly held sway. Someone killed Uncle Ben. Someone chose to end a good man's life rather than accept the consequences of their criminal actions. And that person needs to be found and stopped and made to pay for what they've done. Peter excuses himself from the hospital waiting room, claiming he needs air, his mind already shifting into Spider-Man mode, already planning how he'll use his abilities to find Ben's killer and deliver the justice that the legal system might fail to provide. Changing into his Spider-Man costume in a hospital bathroom feels surreal and wrong. But Peter's rage overrides any sense of inappropriateness or hesitation. The police have cordoned off the warehouse where the shooting occurred, setting up a perimeter and beginning their investigation, but they're looking for a normal criminal who might hide in normal places. Peter's enhanced abilities allow him to approach the scene from angles that regular officers would never consider, climbing walls and moving through shadows, using his spider sense to track traces of the gunman's passage that no normal person would detect. The trail leads him through back alleys and across rooftops, following a path that makes sense for someone trying to evade police, while staying off the main streets where witnesses might remember seeing a man running from the scene of a murder. The old warehouse on the waterfront where the trail ends is dark and apparently abandoned. The kind of building that criminals use for exactly this kind of hiding, waiting for the immediate manhunt to lose intensity before attempting to flee the area more openly. Peter's anger has been building during the pursuit, fed by images of Uncle Ben's last moments, by imagined scenarios of his fear and pain, by the knowledge that a good man died trying to stop evil and that evil temporarily won. The man hiding inside this warehouse represents everything wrong with the world, everything that Peter's powers could fight against if he chose to use them that way, and right now, consumed by grief and rage, Peter is ready to make that choice. The confrontation happens quickly, with Peter using his abilities to corner the killer before the man even realizes he's been found. Peter webs the gun away and pins the criminal against a wall, his enhanced strength making resistance impossible, his anger making him seriously consider whether the legal system deserves the chance to potentially fail, whether justice might not be better served by more direct and permanent means. The killer, terrified and babbling excuses, turns toward Peter's masked face, and in that moment of connection, in that instant when their eyes meet, Peter's world collapses around him as recognition hits like a physical blow. It's the same man, the same thief who ran past Peter in the television studio hallway 2 weeks ago. The same person that the security guard begged Peter to stop. The same criminal that Peter deliberately allowed to escape because he didn't think it was his problem, because he valued his own convenience over his obligation to prevent harm. The recognition is mutual and devastating, with the killer stammering about how he remembers Peter from before, how Spider-Man could have caught him then but didn't. How if he'd been stopped at the television studio, then he wouldn't have been free to commit the robbery that led to the security guard's murder. The words confirm what Peter already knows with terrible certainty, that Uncle Ben's death is his fault, that his choice to step aside and let the thief escape directly resulted in the loss of the person he loved most in the world. The lesson that Uncle Ben had tried to teach, the wisdom about responsibility and character that Peter dismissed as irrelevant to his new life as Spider-Man the Entertainer, crashes over him with the force of revelation and condemnation. With great power comes great responsibility, Ben had said during one of their talks in the basement workshop. Words that Peter heard but didn't truly understand, didn't internalize, didn't allow to shape his choices and his use of his extraordinary abilities. The power that the spider bite gave Peter wasn't just a gift or a lucky break or a meal ticket to financial success. It was a responsibility, an obligation to use those abilities to prevent exactly the kind of tragedy that his selfishness has now caused. Peter webs up the killer and leaves him for the police to find, along with evidence of his guilt and the stolen money and the gun that killed Uncle Ben. But the real justice, the real payment for Ben's death, won't come from the legal system or from any punishment that the courts might impose. The debt is owed by Peter himself, payable only through a complete transformation of how he understands and uses his powers, through a commitment to ensure that his failure never happens again, that no one else dies because Spider-Man stood aside when he had the power to act. The grief and guilt that threaten to crush Peter under their combined weight become instead the foundation of something new. Something that honours Ben's memory better than any monument or tribute ever could. Walking home through the pre-dawn darkness, still wearing his Spider-Man costume under his jacket, Peter makes a vow that will define the rest of his life. Never again will he use his powers solely for personal benefit. Never again will he stand aside when he has the ability to help others. Never again will he prioritise his own comfort and gain over his responsibility to protect innocent people from those who would harm them. The teenager who went to the television studio seeking fame and fortune has been destroyed by the consequences of his own selfishness, and from those ashes emerges something different, something harder and more purposeful, something that understands that great power comes with great responsibility. that abilities like his exist not to make his life easier, but to make the world safer for people who can't protect themselves. Uncle Ben's funeral takes place on a grey December morning when the sky seems to mourn with Peter and Aunt May. The service attended by neighbours and friends who tell stories about Ben's kindness and generosity, about his willingness to help anyone who needed it, about his fundamental decency and his quiet wisdom. Peter listens to these tributes and feels each one like a knife to his heart, because he knows that Ben's death was preventable, that the man being remembered and celebrated should still be alive, should still be offering his gentle guidance and unconditional love, should still be working in his basement workshop and sitting on his front porch and being the moral centre of Peter's world. The guilt that Peter carries is too heavy and too personal to share, so he grieves alone even while surrounded by people, isolated by the secret knowledge that he bears responsibility for the loss that everyone else attributes to random violence and bad luck. The promise that Peter makes at his uncle's graveside is silent but absolute. A commitment that no one else hears but that will guide every choice he makes for the rest of his life. He promises that Uncle Ben's death will not be meaningless, that the lesson bought at such terrible cost will be learned and applied, that the power Peter possesses will be dedicated to preventing other families from suffering the kind of loss that has devastated May and himself. Spider-Man is born not from the spider bite or from the discovery of enhanced abilities, but from this moment of terrible understanding, from the recognition that power without responsibility is worse than useless. It's actively dangerous, capable of causing harm through inaction as much as through direct evil. The boy who gained spider powers by accident has become a man who understands purpose and obligation, who recognizes that his abilities were never really his to do with as he pleased, but rather a trust that carries with it absolute and inescapable responsibility to use them in service of others, regardless of the personal cost. The weeks following Uncle Ben's death mark the true beginning of Peter Parker's career as a hero, though these early attempts at crime fighting bear little resemblance to the polished and practiced heroism that Spider-Man will eventually become known for. The transformation from guilt-driven teenager to competent defender of the innocent is neither quick nor easy, filled instead with mistakes and misjudgments that teach Peter painful lessons about the gap between good intentions and effective action. Each night that he ventures out in his crude costume, swinging between buildings on web lines that sometimes hold and sometimes don't, he discovers new ways that his powers can fail him when he doesn't understand how to use them properly. New situations where enhanced strength and wall-crawling abilities aren't enough to solve problems that require wisdom and experience as much as they require superhuman capabilities. The costume itself becomes an immediate source of frustration and practical difficulty as the hastily assembled outfit that served well enough for a single wrestling match proves completely inadequate for serious crime-fighting work. The ski mask doesn't breathe properly, leaving Peter gasping for air during extended pursuits, the fabric growing damp with condensation from his breath, and making it difficult to see clearly through the eye holes he cut too small in his haste to create something functional. The red sweatshirt with its hand-drawn spiderweb pattern catches on rough surfaces and tears easily, requiring constant repair that Aunt May notices and questions, forcing Peter to invent elaborate stories about accidents at school or mishaps during his supposed study sessions at the library. The blue sweatpants offer no protection against the cold December wind that whips between buildings and makes extended patrol sessions exercises in discomfort and endurance. The web shooters that Peter designs and builds in the privacy of his bedroom represent his first serious attempt to supplement his natural abilities with technology, to create tools that will make him more effective in his new mission. The devices themselves are marvels of miniaturization and chemical engineering, small enough to wear on his wrists beneath his costume sleeves, but powerful enough to shoot strands of synthetic webbing that can support his weight and bind criminals with surprising strength. But the early prototypes are unreliable in ways that create dangerous situations, sometimes firing when he doesn't want them to, and sometimes failing to fire when he desperately needs them, sometimes producing web fluid that dissolves too quickly, and sometimes creating strands that are so strong he can't break them himself. When he needs to free someone, he's accidentally webbed. The mistakes come frequently during these early weeks, each one teaching Peter something valuable about the proper use of his abilities, but also creating collateral damage that weighs on his conscience and reinforces his sense that he's fumbling toward competence rather than naturally possessing it. He webs innocent bystanders by accident, mistaking frightened witnesses for fleeing criminals in the chaos of confrontation, forcing him to apologize profusely while cutting them free and hoping they won't report the incident to authorities, who might start asking uncomfortable questions about who Spider-Man really is and whether his vigilante activities are helping or creating new problems. He misjudges his strength and accidentally breaks the arm of a purse snatcher when he meant only to restrain him. The sickening crack of bone and the criminal's scream of pain teaching Peter that his enhanced strength requires constant mindful control, that he can't simply grab people the way he would have before the spider bite without risking serious injury. The property damage that Spider-Man causes during these early adventures becomes a recurring source of guilt and anxiety, as Peter discovers that stopping crimes often involves breaking things that belong to innocent people who are already victims of the criminal activity he's trying to prevent. He crashes through a storefront window while pursuing a robbery suspect, leaving the shop owner with hundreds of dollars in repair costs that Peter has no way to compensate. He accidentally crushes a parked car when he lands on it from 3 stories up, his impact creating damage that someone's insurance will have to cover while they wonder what kind of freak accident could have caused such destruction. He tears down a fire escape while climbing a building in pursuit of a fleeing mugger, the old metal unable to support his weight even though his wall-crawling abilities should have made using the fire escape unnecessary in the first place. The timing failures represent perhaps the most frustrating category of mistakes. Moments when Peter arrives too late to prevent crimes that his spider sense warned him about, but that he couldn't reach in time because he's still learning to navigate the city efficiently. He senses a mugging 3 blocks away but takes wrong turns in his web-slinging route and arrives to find the victim already injured and the criminal already fled. He detects a break-in at a jewellery store but gets tangled in his own web line and falls behind. Reaching the scene only after the thieves have loaded their van and escaped into traffic that Peter can't pursue without revealing his abilities to dozens of witnesses. Each failure to arrive in time reinforces Peter's understanding that having powers isn't enough, that being a hero requires skill and knowledge and practice, that he needs to learn the geography of his neighbourhood with the same thoroughness he once devoted to memorising periodic tables and scientific formulas. The physical exhaustion that comes from maintaining his double life begins to accumulate during these weeks, as Peter discovers that being Spider-Man on top of being a student creates demands on his time and energy that seem impossible to satisfy simultaneously. The late nights spent patrolling for crimes and responding to his spider sense warnings leave him barely able to stay awake during his morning classes, nodding off at his desk while teachers drone on about subjects that suddenly seem trivial compared to the life and death struggles he's facing after dark. The injuries he sustains during his crime-fighting activities, the bruises and cuts and strained muscles that come from learning through trial and error, require him to move carefully and hide his discomfort from Aunt May, who notices everything and worries constantly about his well-being without knowing the true source of his various aches and pains. The academic performance that was once Peter's greatest source of pride and accomplishment begins to slip as his attention and energy flow toward his new mission, creating concern among teachers who have always counted on him to be their best student. They're proof that intelligence and dedication can overcome any obstacle. His homework becomes rushed and incomplete. His test scores drop from perfect to merely good. His participation in class discussions fades as he struggles to stay awake and focused on material that feels disconnected from the real-world problems he's confronting every night. The guidance counselor calls him in for a conference about his changing attitude and declining grades, expressing worry that something is troubling him at home. That perhaps Uncle Ben's death has affected him more deeply than he's willing to admit, and Peter can only nod and make vague promises about trying harder, while knowing that he can't possibly explain the real reason for his struggles. The development of his spider sense from a vague tingling sensation into a reliable early warning system requires Peter's conscious attention and experimentation as he learns to distinguish between different levels and types of danger, to interpret the strength and direction of the warnings his enhanced awareness provides. A slight tingle might indicate minor risk, like an argument about to turn physical, while a strong sustained sensation warns of immediate deadly threats like guns being aimed in his direction or structural collapses about to occur. The sense doesn't provide specific information about the nature of dangers, creating situations where Peter responds to warnings only to discover that the threat was different than he anticipated. That his spider sense can tell him that something bad is about to happen, but can't explain exactly what that something is or how he should respond to prevent it. The learning curve for web slinging proves particularly steep and occasionally dangerous, as Peter discovers through painful experience that momentum and trajectory and timing all matter enormously when swinging between buildings on strands of artificial spider silk. He learns that he needs to release his web line at exactly the right point in his swing to maintain altitude and distance, that holding on too long sends him crashing into walls while releasing too early drops him into alleys or onto rooftops with jarring impacts that even his enhanced durability can't make comfortable. He learns that web lines need secure anchor points strong enough to support his weight and the forces generated by his swinging motion, discovering this lesson when a weakened cornice breaks free under the strain and sends him plummeting toward the street below, saved only by his quick reflexes and his ability to shoot a new line before gravity completes its work. The relationship between Peter and Aunt May becomes more complicated during this period, as he struggles to maintain the appearance of normal teenage life while actually living a double existence that requires constant deception and careful management of information. May notices that Peter seems distant and preoccupied, that he startles easily and seems to be listening to things she can't hear, that he comes home with unexplained bruises and torn clothing, that he dismisses with increasingly implausible stories about clumsiness or accidents at school. She attributes these changes to grief and the difficult process of adjusting to life without Uncle Ben, not realizing that Peter's transformation goes far deeper than normal mourning, that he's becoming someone fundamentally different from the boy she's raised, someone carrying burdens and responsibilities that would crush most adults, let alone a teenage student. The financial situation that Peter had hoped to help by his Spider-Man performances becomes worse rather than better after Uncle Ben's death, as the household loses Ben's income and gains funeral expenses and medical bills that strain resources already stretched thin. Peter wants desperately to contribute to the family finances, to ease Aunt May's obvious stress about money, but his decision to dedicate his abilities to crime fighting rather than entertainment means he's given up the television appearances and their substantial paychecks. The coffee can full of money from his brief career as Spider-Man the Entertainer gets quietly donated to May's household fund, explained as savings from odd jobs that Peter can no longer remember doing, and the amount helps, but doesn't solve the underlying problem that a widow living on a limited income cannot easily support herself and a teenage dependent. The costume improvements that Peter implements during these early weeks represent his attempts to address the most obvious practical problems with his crime-fighting outfit, though he lacks the resources and skills to create anything truly professional or effective. He replaces the ski mask with a full head covering made from red fabric that he sews himself using May's machine when she's out shopping, adding large white mesh panels over the eyes that allow better visibility while still concealing his identity. He reinforces the sweatshirt with patches and stronger thread, trying to make it more durable, though the basic design remains crude, and the hand-drawn web pattern still looks amateurish and childish. He adds thin gloves to protect his hands during wall crawling, and to hide his fingerprints, not yet understanding that his wall-crawling ability works through some kind of molecular bonding that functions even through fabric. The public reaction to Spider-Man's early appearances is mixed and confused, with witnesses unable to agree on basic facts about what they've seen, or whether the costumed figure swinging through Queens is trying to help, or simply creating new problems. Some people appreciate his interventions, grateful that someone with abilities is willing to put themselves at risk to protect others, writing letters to newspapers praising the mysterious Spider-Man and calling for police to work with him rather than against him. Others view him with suspicion and fear, uncomfortable with the idea of a masked vigilante operating outside legal authority, questioning his motives and suggesting that anyone who hides their identity must have something to hide, that true heroes would work openly with legitimate law enforcement rather than skulking in shadows and disappearing before police arrive to take statements. The learning process through which Peter transforms from clumsy amateur to competent hero happens gradually, built on hundreds of small lessons learned through trial and error, through mistakes that teach him what not to do, and successes that show him what works. He learns to anticipate how criminals will react when confronted, discovers that some flee while others fight, that some surrender immediately while others escalate violence rather than accept capture. He learns the geography of his neighborhood with intimate detail, memorizing which buildings have strong enough structures to support web swinging, which alleys provide shortcuts, which rooftops offer clear views of the streets below where crimes might be unfolding. He learns to pace himself during long nights of patrol, to conserve his energy and his web fluid, to prioritize responses based on the severity of crimes his spider sense detects, rather than trying to respond to everything and arriving too exhausted to help anyone effectively. The development of his fighting style happens organically through the experience of confronting criminals who have no intention of surrendering peacefully, who respond to Spider-Man's intervention with violence that forces Peter to defend himself while also trying to avoid causing serious injury to people who are, despite their criminal actions, still human beings deserving of some measure of consideration and restraint. He learns to use his web shooters defensively, creating barriers between himself and attackers, binding weapons to prevent their use, immobilizing opponents without needing to strike them physically. He learns to use his enhanced agility and his spider sense to avoid attacks rather than blocking them, to make criminals exhaust themselves swinging at empty air while he conserves his energy and waits for opportunities to end confrontations quickly and with minimal harm to everyone involved. The isolation that Peter feels during this period is profound and sometimes overwhelming, as his double life creates barriers between himself and everyone he knows that prevent genuine intimacy or honest communication. He can't tell Aunt May what he's really doing at night. Can't share with his classmates the incredible experiences he's having. Can't seek advice or comfort from anyone who might understand the unique challenges he faces. The secret of his identity becomes a weight that he carries alone, creating a fundamental loneliness that no amount of heroic success can truly alleviate, because the victories he achieves as Spider-Man must remain anonymous, while Peter Parker continues to be invisible and overlooked by his peers. The question of why he continues, why he persists in this difficult and dangerous mission despite the costs and the isolation and the constant risk of failure, has a simple answer that Peter reminds himself of whenever the burden feels too heavy to bear. Uncle Ben died because Peter chose to use his powers selfishly rather than responsibly. Died because of a failure that can never be undone or forgiven, only honoured through a commitment to ensure it never happens again. Every criminal that Spider-Man stops, every innocent person that he protects, every tragedy that he prevents represents a small payment against an infinite debt, a way of making meaning from meaningless loss, a method of transforming grief and guilt into something that might honour Uncle Ben's memory better than any monument or tribute ever could. The transformation that these weeks of learning and struggle accomplish is fundamental and lasting, changing Peter from someone who viewed his powers as a personal asset into someone who understands them as a public trust, someone who recognizes that great power really does come with great responsibility, that the abilities the spider bite gave him exist not to make his life easier, but to make the world safer for people who cannot protect themselves. The mistakes and failures hurt, the exhaustion and isolation wear him down. But the mission itself provides purpose and meaning that make the sacrifices feel worthwhile, that give shape and direction to a life that might otherwise have been consumed entirely by grief and regret. The financial pressures that weigh on the Parker household during the months following Uncle Ben's death create a constant undercurrent of stress and worry that affects every aspect of daily life. From decisions about what groceries to buy to calculations about which bills can be delayed without serious consequences. Aunt May tries to hide her anxiety from Peter, maintaining a brave face and insisting that everything will be fine, that they'll manage just as they always have. But Peter sees the evidence of their strange circumstances in the way she studies the checkbook with furrowed brow, in the way she turns off lights in empty rooms to save electricity, in the way she mends clothes that should probably be replaced rather than spending money on new items that the budget simply cannot accommodate. The modest life insurance policy that Uncle Ben maintained helps with immediate expenses, but doesn't solve the underlying problem that a household designed for 2 incomes is now operating on less than 1, creating a gap that grows wider with each passing month. The idea that changes everything comes to Peter during one of his early Spider-Man patrols, when he stops a convenience store robbery and finds himself thinking about how dramatic the confrontation must have looked, how the visual spectacle of a costumed figure swinging through a window and webbing up armed criminals would make for compelling photographs if anyone had been positioned to capture the moment. The thought crystallizes into a plan during the walk home, as Peter realizes that his abilities allow him to be in 2 places at once, figuratively speaking, that he could position a camera to photograph Spider-Man in action, and then become the subject of those photographs, creating a situation where he's both the photographer selling the pictures and the superhero appearing in them. The scheme feels slightly dishonest in a way that makes Peter uncomfortable. But it also represents a potential solution to his family's financial problems that doesn't require him to give up his mission as Spider-Man or return to performing for television audiences. The camera that Peter uses for his first attempts at photographing Spider-Man is the same one that Uncle Ben gave him for his 14th birthday, a decent quality model that Ben saved for months to afford. Believing that Peter's interest in science might extend to the technical and artistic aspects of photography. The camera has mostly sat unused in Peter's closet, pulled out occasionally for school projects but never seriously explored. But now it becomes an essential tool in Peter's plan to generate income without abandoning his commitment to crime fighting. The technical challenges of photographing himself in action while simultaneously fighting criminals prove substantial and require Peter to develop an elaborate system of timers and triggers, of carefully positioned cameras and web-attached remote releases that allow him to capture images while remaining free to move and respond to threats. The process of setting up shots requires Peter to think about his heroic activities in new ways, to choreograph his movements not just for maximum effectiveness in stopping crimes, but also for maximum visual impact in creating photographs that will be dramatic enough to sell. He learns to position himself in ways that will create compelling compositions, to time his web swinging so that cameras will catch him in mid-arc against the backdrop of the city skyline, to engineer confrontations with criminals so that the decisive moments happen within frame of prepositioned equipment. The dual focus on fighting crime and documenting his own heroism creates additional complexity in situations that are already dangerous and unpredictable. But Peter becomes surprisingly adept at managing both objectives simultaneously, his enhanced reflexes and his spider sense allowing him to track camera positions and timing, even while dealing with immediate threats. The question of where to sell the photographs leads Peter to consider various publications, from the sensationalist tabloids that might pay well but would treat Spider-Man as a freak show attraction, to the more respectable newspapers that might offer less money but would present his heroic activities in a context that feels more aligned with his mission and values. The Daily Bugle emerges as the obvious choice, not because it's the most prestigious newspaper in New York, but because it's the most aggressive in pursuing dramatic stories and eye-catching images, the kind of publication that would immediately recognize the value of exclusive photographs showing a mysterious costumed hero in action. The Bugle's reputation for sensationalism and its willingness to pay competitive rates for compelling photographs make it the perfect market for Peter's unique product. The Daily Bugle building stands in the heart of Manhattan, a towering structure that houses the newspaper's editorial offices, printing facilities, and the organised chaos of a major metropolitan publication operating on tight deadlines and constant pressure to find stories that will sell papers and attract readers. Peter's first visit to the Bugle offices takes place on a Saturday afternoon in late January. When he's finally accumulated enough photographs to feel confident approaching the newspaper with his proposal, he carries the images in a manila envelope that he grips tightly as he rides the elevator up to the editorial floor, his nervousness about this business transaction competing with his determination to help Aunt May with their financial struggles. The receptionist who greets Peter when he steps off the elevator is Betty Brandt, a young woman perhaps 3 or 4 years older than Peter. Possessed of a professional poise and genuine warmth that immediately puts him at ease despite his anxiety about this meeting. Betty sits behind a desk that seems designed to overwhelm its occupant, surrounded by filing cabinets and ringing telephones and the general organised confusion of a busy newspaper office. But she maintains an island of calm competence in the midst of chaos, answering calls and directing visitors and managing the flow of information with practiced efficiency. When Peter approaches and stammers out his explanation that he has some photographs that might interest the newspaper, Betty's smile is kind rather than condescending, and she asks to see what he's brought with the genuine interest of someone who recognises that news can come from unexpected sources. The photographs that Peter spreads across Betty's desk capture Spider-Man in various dramatic poses and situations, swinging between buildings with the city spread below him, confronting criminals in dark alleys, rescuing a child from a fire escape, each image carefully selected to showcase both the hero's abilities and the photographer's skill. Betty's eyes widen as she examines the pictures, her professional composure slipping slightly as she realizes what she's looking at. Exclusive images of the mysterious Spider-Man that every newspaper in the city would want to publish. Delivers the story he's prepared about. Delivers the story he's prepared about being a freelance photographer who makes it his business to follow police scanners and show up at crime scenes, about being lucky and persistent and willing to take risks that other photographers might avoid. The moment when Betty picks up her phone and asks to speak with Mr. Jameson, explaining that she has something he needs to see immediately, marks the beginning of Peter's complicated relationship with the Daily Bugle and its publisher, Jay. Jonah Jameson emerges from his office like a force of nature, a middle-aged man with a bristling moustache and an air of perpetual outrage, barking questions and demands as he strides toward Betty's desk. His physical presence is imposing despite his average height. Created through sheer force of personality and the aggressive energy of someone who has built a publishing empire through determination and an instinct for what sells newspapers. When he sees the Spider-Man photographs spread across Betty's desk, his expression shifts through several emotions in rapid succession, professional excitement about a great story competing with something else, something that looks almost like suspicion or immediate dislike. Jameson's questions come rapid fire as he examines the photographs more closely, demanding to know who took them and how and when and what Peter wants for exclusive rights to publish. The negotiation that follows is brief and somewhat one-sided, with Jameson's experience as a publisher allowing him to set terms that are favourable to the Bugle, while still offering Peter more money than he's ever earned through legitimate work. The amount that Jameson agrees to pay for the first batch of photographs is substantial enough to make a meaningful difference in the Parker household budget. Enough to buy groceries and pay utilities and create a small cushion against the unexpected expenses that always seem to arise at the worst possible times. Peter accepts the offer with a mixture of gratitude and careful neutrality, not wanting to seem too eager or too desperate, trying to project the professional demeanour of someone who understands the value of what he's selling. But even as Jameson writes the cheque and explains the terms of their arrangement, that Peter will be a freelance photographer with no guarantee of future purchases, but with the understanding that the Bugle will have first right of refusal on any Spider-Man photographs, there's an undercurrent of something uncomfortable in the publisher's attitude. Jameson's questions about Spider-Man carry a tone of skepticism and hostility that seems disproportionate to the situation, as if the very existence of a costumed hero offends some fundamental principle that Jameson holds dear. His comments about masks and anonymity, about the dangers of vigilantes operating outside proper authority, about the suspicious nature of anyone who hides their identity while claiming to help others, reveal a mindset that views Spider-Man not as a hero, but as a problem, a threat to the established order that must be questioned and challenged. The irony of the situation is not lost on Peter as he leaves the Daily Bugle building with Jameson's cheque in his pocket. That the same person who risks his life fighting crime as Spider-Man will profit from selling photographs of those heroic activities to a publisher who despises the hero and will use the images to illustrate editorials questioning Spider-Man's motives and methods. The arrangement creates a strange circularity where Peter's crime-fighting activities generate the photographs that generate the income that allows him to continue crime-fighting, while simultaneously funding a publicity campaign against his alter ego. The moral complexity of the situation troubles Peter somewhat, but the practical necessity of helping Aunt May with household expenses outweighs his discomfort with Jameson's attitude. Betty Brant's role in facilitating Peter's relationship with the Daily Bugle extends beyond the simple administrative task of processing his photograph submissions and arranging payment. Over the weeks and months that follow Peter's initial visit, a friendship develops between them that is based partly on their regular professional interactions and partly on Betty's genuine kindness toward this young photographer who seems so earnest and dedicated despite his obvious inexperience with the business side of journalism. She offers advice about negotiating with Jameson, warns Peter when the publisher is in a particularly foul mood, advocates for better rates when Peter's photographs are especially dramatic or newsworthy. Her attention and interest represent something that Peter hasn't experienced before, a young woman who treats him with respect and warmth, who sees value in him beyond his utility as a homework resource or his abilities as Spider-Man. The attraction that Peter feels toward Betty develops gradually, built on their repeated interactions and the genuine connection that forms between two people who are both working hard to build lives for themselves in a challenging world. Betty is several years older than Peter and has more life experience, having supported herself and helped support her family since finishing high school, but she doesn't condescend to him or treat him as a child despite the age gap. Their conversations during Peter's visits to the Bugle offices range from professional discussions about photography and payment to more personal exchanges about their lives and their dreams, about the challenges they face and the goals they hope to achieve. Betty shares carefully edited stories about her family situation, about a mother who depends on her income and a brother whose gambling problems create constant financial crises, while Peter offers equally edited accounts of his life with Aunt May and his struggles to manage school while working as a photographer. The romantic feelings that begin to develop between Peter and Betty are complicated by the barriers that his double life creates, by the fact that he can never be completely honest with her about who he really is or what he's really doing. When Betty asks how he always seems to know where Spider-Man will appear, how he manages to be in position to capture such perfect photographs, Peter must offer vague explanations about police scanner monitoring and lucky guesses, stories that don't quite make sense if examined too closely, but that Betty accepts because she trusts him and because questioning too deeply might reveal things she's not prepared to know. The relationship that develops is built on partial truths and careful omissions, creating an intimacy that feels genuine but that Peter knows is fundamentally incomplete, limited by the secrets he must keep and the life he cannot share. Jameson's editorial campaign against Spider-Man begins almost immediately after the Daily Bugle starts publishing Peter's photographs, as if the visual evidence of the wall-crawler's existence and activities triggers something in the publisher that demands expression through increasingly strident denunciations. The editorials that Jameson writes present Spider-Man as a menace to society, a vigilante whose activities undermine proper law enforcement, and whose masked anonymity suggests criminal intent or cowardly unwillingness to face responsibility for his actions. The accusations range from the somewhat reasonable, questioning whether costumed heroes should operate without oversight or accountability, to the completely unfounded, suggesting that Spider-Man might be in league with the criminals he appears to fight, that his heroic activities might be staged publicity stunts designed to build his reputation while actually advancing some hidden agenda. The psychological impact of reading these editorials, of seeing his alter ego portrayed as a threat and a fraud by the very publication that pays him for photographs of his heroic activities, creates a kind of cognitive dissonance that Peter struggles to process and understand. He knows the truth about his motivations and his mission, knows that he's genuinely trying to help people and prevent crimes, knows that the risks he takes are real and the criminals he fights are genuinely dangerous. But Jameson's editorials, written with conviction and published in a major newspaper, begin to influence public opinion in ways that make Peter's work as Spider-Man more difficult and more dangerous. Police become less willing to tolerate his presence at crime scenes, viewing him as a complication rather than an asset. Citizens who might have appreciated his interventions become suspicious and frightened, wondering if the masked figure swinging through their neighbourhood is really trying to help or pursuing some darker purpose. The financial arrangement between Peter and the Daily Bugle settles into a regular pattern over the following months, with Peter making weekly or bi-weekly visits to deliver new photographs and collect payment for images the newspaper chooses to publish. The income, while irregular and dependent on Peter's ability to generate dramatic photographs, provides meaningful support for the Parker household and eases some of the financial pressure that has weighed so heavily on Aunt May since Uncle Ben's death. Peter carefully manages his explanation of this income stream to his aunt, presenting himself as a freelance photographer who has developed a specialty in news and action photography, who gets paid based on what newspapers choose to buy rather than earning a regular salary. May is proud of Peter's entrepreneurial spirit and grateful for his contributions to the household budget, unaware that the photographs he sells are actually of himself engaged in dangerous crime-fighting activities. The time that Peter spends in the Daily Bugle offices waiting to meet with Jameson, or waiting for Betty to process his submissions, becomes a kind of education in journalism and publishing. As he observes the controlled chaos of producing a daily newspaper and learns about the business of gathering and selling news, he watches reporters rushing to meet deadlines, editors arguing about story placement and headline phrasing, photographers comparing equipment and complaining about assignments. The environment is loud and energetic and sometimes crude, filled with people who are passionate about their work even when they're complaining about it, who believe that what they do matters even when they're cynical about the details. Peter finds himself drawn to this world, fascinated by the process of turning raw information into printed pages that will be read by hundreds of thousands of people across the city. Betty's presence in this environment provides an anchor and a human connection that makes the Daily Bugle feel less intimidating and more welcoming, transforming it from a place where Peter sells photographs into a place where he has a friend, where someone knows his name and seems genuinely pleased to see him when he arrives. The conversations they share during slow periods, when the phones are quiet and no urgent business demands Betty's attention, become highlights of Peter's visits to the newspaper. They talk about movies they've seen or want to see, about books they're reading, about the small pleasures and frustrations of daily life in New York City. Betty tells stories about growing up in Philadelphia and moving to New York for better opportunities, about learning to navigate the city and build a life as an independent young woman. Peter shares carefully edited versions of his own experiences, talking about school and his dreams of becoming a scientist, about living with Aunt May and missing Uncle Ben, about the challenges of trying to figure out who he is and what he wants from life. The development of genuine affection between Peter and Betty happens naturally through these repeated interactions, through the accumulation of small moments of connection and understanding that build into something more substantial than simple friendship. Betty represents something that Peter has never really had before, someone outside of his family who seems to genuinely like him for who he is rather than for what he can do or provide, someone who treats him as an equal despite their age difference and her greater experience in the world. For Betty, Peter represents a kind of innocence and earnestness that's rare in her experience, a young man who seems genuinely good and sincere in a world that often rewards cynicism and self-interest, someone who makes her want to encourage and protect rather than manipulate or use. The complications that Peter's double life creates for this budding relationship become apparent when Betty notices inconsistencies in his schedule and availability. When she asks him to meet for coffee and he has to cancel because Spider-Man duties demand his attention, when she comments on bruises or cuts that he explains away with increasingly implausible stories about clumsiness or accidents, Betty is perceptive enough to recognize that Peter is hiding something, that the stories he tells don't quite add up, but she's also kind enough not to push too hard for explanations that he's clearly reluctant to provide. The questions she doesn't ask hang in the air between them, creating a subtle tension that reminds both of them that their relationship, however genuine their feelings, is built on incomplete honesty and partial truths. Jameson's attitude toward Peter himself is notably different from his attitude toward Spider-Man, creating another layer of irony in their business relationship. The publisher treats Peter with the gruff tolerance of someone dealing with a useful vendor, occasionally complimenting his photographic skill, while more often complaining about rates or image quality, or the lack of photographs that show Spider-Man in compromising or questionable situations. Jameson clearly doesn't connect the earnest teenage photographer who sells him pictures with any possibility of that teenager being the masked hero in the photographs, the idea apparently too absurd to even consider. The invisibility that Peter has cultivated his entire life, the ability to be overlooked and underestimated, serves him well in this situation, allowing him to operate in plain sight without raising suspicions that might otherwise doom his entire enterprise. The strange ecosystem that develops around Peter's dual role as Spider-Man and as Spider-Man's photographer creates a sustainable, if morally complex situation that allows him to continue his crime-fighting mission while also addressing his family's financial needs. The photographs document his heroic activities and provide proof that Spider-Man exists and acts to protect innocent people. Even as the editorials that accompany those photographs work to undermine public trust and paint the hero as a menace, Peter learns to live with this contradiction, to accept that he can control his actions but not how others interpret them, that doing the right thing doesn't guarantee recognition or appreciation, that sometimes the best you can hope for is to keep working toward your goals, despite opposition and misunderstanding. The relationship with Betty continues to deepen through spring and into summer, providing Peter with emotional support and human connection that make his isolated, heroic mission feel slightly less lonely, even though he can never tell her the full truth about his life. They begin spending time together outside of the Daily Bugle offices, going to movies or walking through parks, having conversations that range from playful and light-hearted to serious and thoughtful. Betty becomes someone Peter can talk to about Uncle Ben's death and his grief, someone who listens with compassion and understanding, rather than offering empty platitudes or trying to fix problems that can't be fixed. Peter becomes someone Betty can confide in about her family troubles and her own struggles to build a stable life, someone who takes her seriously and respects her strength even when she's feeling vulnerable and overwhelmed. The future seems to stretch before Peter with new possibilities during this period. A future where he might successfully balance his responsibilities as Spider-Man with something approaching a normal life, where he might maintain relationships and pursue his education and helps support Aunt May, all while continuing his mission to honour Uncle Ben's memory through service to others. The arrangement with the Daily Bugle, however morally complicated, seems sustainable for the foreseeable future. The relationship with Betty, however constrained by necessary secrets, feels genuine and valuable. The heroic mission itself, though challenging and sometimes discouraging, provides purpose and meaning that make all the sacrifices feel worthwhile. The criminals that Spider-Man encounters during these early months of his career represent a diverse array of motivations and methods, each one teaching Peter something different about the nature of crime and the complexity of the human capacity for both harm and redemption. The common muggers and burglars who make up the majority of his interventions are often people driven by desperation or addiction, making poor choices in difficult circumstances rather than embodying pure evil, and Peter learns to see them as individuals rather than simply as obstacles to be overcome. But alongside these street-level criminals, a different category of threat begins to emerge. People whose crimes involve exotic technologies or enhanced abilities, who operate on a scale that goes beyond simple theft or violence into territory that requires Spider-Man to expand his understanding of what heroism might demand from him. The Vulture represents one of the first true superpowered threats that Spider-Man faces, an enemy whose abilities rival Peter's own in ways that make their confrontations genuinely dangerous and unpredictable. Adrian Toombs is an elderly man by conventional standards, someone who should be enjoying retirement and grandchildren rather than committing daring high-altitude robberies. But the electromagnetic harness he's designed and built gives him the power of flight, along with enhanced strength that defies his advanced age. The green costume with its massive wings creates a predatory silhouette against the sky, earning Toombs the nickname that will define his criminal career and his place in Spider-Man's growing rogues gallery. The crimes that the Vulture commits are motivated more by resentment and a desire to prove his continued relevance than by pure greed, the actions of someone who feels that the world has discarded and forgotten him. That his years of innovation and expertise count for nothing in a society that values youth over experience. Peter's first encounter with the Vulture happens almost by accident, a routine patrol interrupted by his spider-sense warning of danger from above, directing his attention skyward to see a figure gliding between buildings with mechanical wings that catch the afternoon sunlight. The chase that follows tests Peter's web-slinging abilities in new ways, forcing him to pursue an enemy who can travel in 3 dimensions rather than being confined to surfaces and structures, who can climb and dive and maneuver through airspace with a freedom that Peter's web lines cannot quite match. The Vulture's experience and tactical thinking make him a formidable opponent despite his age, and their first confrontation ends with Peter bruised and frustrated, having failed to capture Toombs or even significantly interfere with his robbery, learning the hard lesson that good intentions and spider powers aren't always enough to defeat enemies who have spent decades perfecting their criminal techniques. The eventual capture of the Vulture comes only after Peter studies his enemy's patterns and methods, developing countermeasures specifically designed to neutralize Toombs' advantages in mobility and experience. The battle that finally brings the Vulture down happens high above the city streets, an aerial confrontation where one mistake by either combatant could result in a fatal fall, where Peter must trust his web shooters and his reflexes completely while also trying to bring down an opponent without killing him, or allowing him to kill himself through his own reckless maneuvers. The victory feels earned but also somehow sad, watching police lead away an elderly man in handcuffs while Toombs rants about respect and recognition, about a world that discards people when they're no longer young and profitable. Peter finds himself wondering about the thin line between someone like Toombs and someone like Uncle Ben. Both elderly men trying to maintain their dignity and purpose in a society that often treats aging as a form of failure. Dr. Octopus emerges as an entirely different kind of threat, someone whose criminal activities stem not from desperation or resentment, but from a toxic combination of brilliance and arrogance that makes him believe the normal rules of society don't apply to someone of his intellectual caliber. Otto Octavius, before his accident, is a researcher of genuine distinction, someone whose work with radioactive materials and mechanical engineering places him at the cutting edge of multiple scientific fields, someone whom Peter might have admired and aspired to emulate under different circumstances. The laboratory accident that fuses 4 mechanical tentacles to Octavius's body and damages his brain creates a being of tremendous power and even more tremendous ego, someone who views ordinary humans as insects to be swept aside, who believes that his superior intellect gives him the right to take what he wants and destroy what stands in his way. The tentacles themselves are marvels of engineering, even as they're instruments of crime and violence. Responding to Octavius's thoughts with perfect precision, capable of lifting enormous weights and performing delicate manipulations with equal facility, extending his reach and his strength far beyond human norms. The 4 appendages give Dr. Octopus advantages in combat that make him one of Spider-Man's most dangerous enemies, able to attack from multiple directions simultaneously, to defend against assaults while maintaining offensive pressure, to manipulate his environment in ways that create constant tactical challenges for someone trying to fight him. The combination of superhuman physical capabilities and genuine genius-level intelligence makes Dr. Octopus a threat that requires Peter to use every advantage he possesses, to think several moves ahead and exploit momentary openings before they close. Peter's first battle with Dr. Octopus serves as a harsh education in the reality that his spider powers don't make him invincible, that enemies exist who can match or exceed his abilities through technology and experience, that overconfidence can lead to defeat and potentially to death. The fight takes place in Octavius's waterfront laboratory, a space filled with dangerous chemicals and unstable equipment, where the battle itself threatens to trigger explosions or releases of toxic materials that could harm innocent people in the surrounding neighborhood. Peter goes into the confrontation expecting his speed and agility to carry the day as they have in previous encounters with criminals, but Dr. Octopus's tentacles prove faster than Peter anticipated, and Octavius's willingness to destroy his own laboratory to eliminate his opponent demonstrates a ruthlessness that catches Peter unprepared. The retreat that Peter makes from that first encounter, wounded and defeated, teaches him that heroism sometimes means recognizing when you're outmatched and withdrawing to fight another day rather than persisting until you're killed or captured. The lizard presents perhaps the most tragic figure in Peter's early rogues gallery. An enemy who is simultaneously a victim deserving of compassion and a threat requiring forceful intervention. Dr. Curtis Connors, the same scientist who conducted the demonstration where Peter was bitten by the radioactive spider, has dedicated his career to developing a serum that could regenerate lost limbs, driven by the personal loss of his own arm and by a genuine desire to help others who have suffered similar injuries. The formula he creates based on lizard DNA achieves its stated goal, regrowing his missing arm with apparent success, but it also triggers a transformation that goes far beyond simple regeneration, turning Connors into a massive reptilian creature with enhanced strength, durability, and predatory instincts that overwhelm his human consciousness and moral reasoning. The lizard that rampages through the sewers beneath New York City retains fragments of Connors' intelligence, but applies that intelligence toward goals that are fundamentally alien to human values, viewing warm-blooded creatures as prey or threats rather than as beings deserving of protection and consideration. The transformation is not complete or permanent, with Connors sometimes fighting his way back to human form and human consciousness, experiencing horror at what he's done while transformed and desperately seeking a cure that will prevent future changes. The moral complexity of fighting an enemy who is also a victim, of trying to stop someone without destroying the innocent person trapped inside the monster, forces Peter to develop new approaches to heroism that go beyond simple combat and capture, that require scientific knowledge and careful planning as much as physical courage and fighting skill. Sandman represents yet another variation on the theme of criminals with extraordinary abilities, someone whose powers come not from technology or scientific accident, but from exposure to experimental radiation that transforms his body at the molecular level. Flint Marko, before his transformation, is a common criminal, someone who makes bad choices and hurts people in pursuit of money and the lifestyle he thinks money will provide. But the accident that turns his body into living sand creates possibilities and temptations that no ordinary criminal would face. The ability to shift his form, to become as hard as stone, or to disperse into individual grains that can slip through the smallest openings, to grow to enormous size or to attack from multiple directions simultaneously, makes Sandman a formidable opponent who requires creative thinking and unconventional tactics to defeat. The tragedy of Sandman's situation, such as it is, lies in the fact that his transformation gives him abilities that could be used for tremendous good, but that he applies exclusively to criminal enterprises, that he views his powers as tools for easier theft, rather than as opportunities for redemption or service. Peter's encounters with Sandman become exercises in problem-solving as much as combat, requiring him to figure out how to contain an enemy who can escape from any conventional prison, how to fight someone who can disperse when struck and reform elsewhere, how to protect innocent bystanders when the battlefield itself becomes fluid and unpredictable. The battles with Sandman often end not with decisive victory but with tactical stalemate, with the criminal escaping to commit crimes another day, teaching Peter that some enemies cannot be permanently defeated but must be opposed each time they emerge. That heroism is sometimes a matter of persistent resistance rather than final triumph. Each of these enemies teaches Peter something different about the nature of villainy and the requirements of heroism, expanding his understanding of what it means to fight for justice in a world where the lines between good and evil are not always clear, where victims can become villains and where the people he fights against are not abstract representations of evil, but complex human beings who have made terrible choices for understandable, if not justifiable, reasons. The Vulture teaches him about the resentments that can poison aging minds and the dangers of feeling discarded by society. Dr. Octopus demonstrates how brilliance without humility or compassion becomes monstrous, how intelligence applied to selfish ends creates suffering far beyond what simple stupidity could accomplish. The Lizard shows him that good intentions can lead to terrible outcomes, that the pursuit of knowledge and healing can release forces that destroy rather than save. Sandman illustrates how opportunity without character leads to waste, how extraordinary abilities mean nothing if the person possessing them lacks the moral foundation to use them well. The physical toll that these battles take on Peter's body accumulates over months of crime fighting, creating a constant state of minor injury and chronic pain that he must hide from Aunt May and explain away when injuries are too obvious to conceal. The bruises and cuts heal faster than they would for a normal person, his enhanced physiology providing accelerated recovery that keeps him functional. But the damage still hurts and still requires time to fully resolve. Peter learns to move carefully during the day to avoid aggravating injuries sustained the night before, to make excuses about sports accidents or clumsiness when May notices him favouring a bruised rib or protecting a strained shoulder. The constant cycle of injury and healing becomes part of the background reality of his double life, something he accepts as the price of his mission without dwelling on the long-term implications of what he's doing to his body. The psychological impact of repeatedly facing enemies who want to kill him, who view his death as an acceptable or even desirable outcome of their confrontations, creates stresses that Peter is too young and too isolated to properly process or understand. The nightmares that sometimes wake him in the early hours feature variations on themes of falling and drowning, of being trapped and overwhelmed, of failing to save people who depend on him. He doesn't connect these dreams to trauma or to the accumulated stress of his heroic activities, viewing them instead as random mental noise that doesn't require attention or concern. The isolation that his secret identity creates means he has no one to talk to about these experiences, no one who could help him understand that what he's feeling is a normal response to abnormal and dangerous situations, that even heroes need support and processing to maintain their mental health. The evolution of Peter's fighting style during this period of encountering superpowered enemies reflects his growing understanding that different opponents require different approaches, that the techniques that work against common criminals fail completely against enemies with exotic abilities and enhanced capabilities. He learns to study his enemies before engaging them when possible, to gather information about their powers and their patterns, to develop specific countermeasures rather than relying solely on his natural advantages. The analytical mind that served him so well in science classes gets applied to tactical problems, treating each enemy as a puzzle to be solved, rather than simply an obstacle to be overcome through superior strength or speed. The web shooters that Peter continually refines and improves become increasingly important tools in his arsenal, as he faces enemies whose powers make simple physical confrontation impractical or impossible. He develops new types of web fluid for specific situations, creating variants that dissolve more quickly for temporary restraints, that harden into nearly unbreakable bonds for containing particularly strong enemies, that form nets or shields or other structures as tactical situations demand. The chemistry required to create these specialized formulas pushes the limits of what Peter can accomplish with the limited equipment and ingredients available to a high school student working in secret. But the challenges inspire innovation that advances his understanding of polymer chemistry and materials science in ways that will serve him well in his future career. The reputation that Spider-Man builds through these encounters with superpowered criminals begins to shift public perception in subtle ways, creating a grudging acknowledgement even among his critics that the wall crawler serves a purpose in fighting threats that ordinary law enforcement cannot effectively address. The police departments of New York City and its surrounding boroughs lack the equipment and training to deal with someone who can fly like the Vulture, or who can disperse into sand like Flint Marko, and Spider-Man's willingness to take on these dangerous opponents provides a service that some officials are beginning to quietly appreciate even if they cannot openly endorse vigilante justice. The relationship between Spider-Man and law enforcement remains complicated and sometimes hostile, but it's no longer uniformly antagonistic, creating space for cooperation in situations where everyone's primary goal is protecting innocent people from superhuman threats. J. Jonah Jameson's editorial response to Spider-Man's battles with superpowered villains reveals the complexity and sometimes the incoherence of the publisher's anti-Spider-Man crusade. On one hand, Jameson acknowledges that criminals like Dr. Octopus pose genuine threats that require extraordinary responses, that normal police procedures fail when confronted with enemies who possess abilities that seem to violate natural law. On the other hand, Jameson uses these same battles as evidence that Spider-Man attracts danger, that his very presence in the city somehow encourages or creates superpowered criminals, that New York would be safer if the wall crawler simply disappeared and stopped inspiring copycat criminals or provoking supervillains into escalating conflicts. The logic is circular and self-serving, designed to support a conclusion that Jameson has already reached rather than to genuinely analyze the situation, but it's effective in maintaining public suspicion of Spider-Man even as the hero risks his life protecting the very people who read Jameson's denunciations. The photographs that Peter sells to the Daily Bugle during this period become more valuable and more dramatic as he documents his encounters with increasingly exotic and dangerous enemies. The images of Spider-Man fighting the Vulture high above the city streets, of tentacles and web lines intertwining during battles with Dr. Octopus, of the lizard's massive form confronting the comparatively small figure of the wall crawler, provide visual evidence that captures public imagination in ways that written descriptions never could. Jameson pays premium rates for these photographs, even as he uses them to illustrate editorials questioning Spider-Man's judgment and motives, creating a financial incentive for Peter to continue documenting his own most dangerous activities, to position cameras and choreograph confrontations in ways that prioritize dramatic imagery alongside tactical effectiveness. The cycle of fighting supervillains, photographing the battles, selling the pictures to fund continued crime fighting becomes a sustainable system that allows Peter to maintain his heroic mission while also contributing to Aunt May's household expenses. The moral compromises involved in profiting from his own heroism while enabling Jameson's propaganda campaign against Spider-Man continue to trouble Peter's conscience. But the practical necessity of the arrangement outweighs his discomfort. He tells himself that the photographs serve a purpose beyond generating income, that they document his activities and provide evidence of both the threats he faces and the service he provides. That future generations might look back on these images and understand what he was trying to accomplish, even if his contemporaries cannot appreciate it. The relationship between Peter Parker, the student, and Peter Parker, the hero, becomes increasingly strained as the demands of fighting superpowered criminals consume more of his time and energy, leaving less available for academic work and normal teenage activities. His grades continue to slide from excellent to merely good. His participation in class discussions diminishes, his friendships with classmates atrophy through neglect, and his inability to maintain social connections when he's constantly exhausted and distracted. The isolation that results from this withdrawal feeds back into his heroic mission, creating a vicious cycle where the more he dedicates himself to being Spider-Man, the less connected he feels to his life as Peter Parker, and the less connected he feels to his civilian identity, the easier it becomes to justify spending even more time in costume-fighting criminals and supervillains. The lessons that these early supervillain encounters teach Peter about heroism and responsibility go beyond simple combat tactics or scientific problem-solving, touching on deeper questions about the nature of good and evil, about the factors that transform ordinary people into threats, about his own obligations to enemies who are also in some sense victims of circumstances beyond their control. The lizard in particular haunts Peter's conscience because Curtis Connors is a good man who wanted to help people, whose only real crime was excessive ambition and insufficient caution in testing his theories on himself. The knowledge that Connors will likely transform again, that the lizard will emerge from the man no matter how many times Peter defeats it and administers the temporary antidote, creates a sense of ongoing responsibility that goes beyond simple law enforcement into territory that feels more like caregiving or medical intervention. The web of connections between Peter's various roles and relationships continues to grow more complex and more difficult to manage as his life becomes increasingly compartmentalized and secretive. Peter Parker, the student, attends classes and tries to maintain passing grades. Peter Parker, the freelance photographer, sells pictures to the Daily Bugle and develops feelings for Betty Brant. Spider-Man fights criminals and supervillains and tries to protect innocent people. The three versions of himself, connected by the same body and the same consciousness but requiring different behaviours and different relationships and different priorities, create internal tensions that Peter is too young and too inexperienced to fully recognise or address. He simply keeps moving forward, responding to each demand as it arises, trusting that somehow all of these pieces will fit together into a coherent whole if he just works hard enough and cares enough and refuses to give up on any of his obligations or commitments. The transition from high school to college represents one of the most significant passages in any young person's life, a movement from the familiar confines of adolescence into the broad possibilities and responsibilities of adulthood. And for Peter Parker, this transition is complicated by the dual nature of his existence and the continuing demands of his mission as Spider-Man. The acceptance letter from Empire State University arrives on a spring afternoon during Peter's final semester at Midtown High, offering him admission to one of New York's most prestigious institutions and the opportunity to pursue his passion for science at a level that his high school education could never provide. The scholarship that accompanies the acceptance, based on Peter's academic record despite its recent decline, makes attendance financially feasible for a family living on Aunt May's limited income. Though the cost of textbooks and supplies and the hundred small expenses that accompany university life will still strain their budget, in ways that make Peter acutely aware of his continuing obligation to contribute through his photography work. The final weeks at Midtown High pass with a strange mixture of nostalgia and relief. As Peter finds himself looking back on 5 years of invisibility and isolation, with something approaching fondness now that escape is imminent and certain. The building that once felt like a prison, filled with people who dismissed or tormented him, transforms into simply a place where he once spent time, losing its power to hurt him as the future opens up with new possibilities. Flash Thompson, who has also been accepted to Empire State University on a football scholarship, continues his casual bullying right up to graduation day, apparently unaware that the dynamic between them has fundamentally shifted, that Peter no longer feels diminished or threatened by Flash's mockery, because Peter has faced genuinely dangerous enemies and survived challenges that Flash couldn't imagine. The distance that Peter has travelled since the spider bite, the person he has become through his experiences as Spider-Man, creates a gulf between his current self and the frightened invisible boy who once walked these halls, making his high school tormentors seem less like threats and more like relics of a past that no longer has power over him. The graduation ceremony itself takes place on a warm June evening, when the setting sun bathes the football field in golden light and proud families gather to watch their children receive diplomas and move forward into uncertain futures. Aunt May attends alone. Sitting in the section reserved for families and friends, her face showing both pride in Peter's achievement and sadness that Uncle Ben cannot be here to witness this milestone. Peter accepts his diploma with appropriate dignity, shaking hands with administrators and posing for photographs that will document this transition. But his mind is already moving ahead to the challenges and opportunities that college will bring. The spider sense that has become his constant companion tingles faintly during the ceremony, alerting him to some minor danger or disturbance several blocks away, and the fact that he must ignore this warning to maintain his civilian role creates the familiar tension between his two lives, the constant calculation of which obligations take priority at any given moment. Empire State University occupies several city blocks in Manhattan, a collection of modern buildings and traditional ivy-covered halls that represent one of the nation's premier institutions for scientific research and education. The campus itself is a world apart from the working-class neighbourhood of Queens where Peter grew up, populated by students from diverse backgrounds and nations, by professors whose names appear in scientific journals and whose research pushes the boundaries of human knowledge. The science facilities in particular capture Peter's imagination during his orientation visit. Laboratories equipped with instruments and technology that make his homemade chemistry equipment look primitive by comparison. Spaces where serious scientific work happens and where students are expected to contribute to genuine research rather than simply memorizing facts from textbooks. The possibility of working in these facilities, of having access to resources that could advance his understanding and potentially improve his equipment as Spider-Man, makes the challenges of college seem worth whatever difficulties they might entail. The financial pressures that accompany Peter's enrollment at Empire State University are significant despite the scholarship that covers tuition, as the costs of textbooks and laboratory fees and basic living expenses quickly accumulate into amounts that strain the Parker household budget. Peter's income from selling photographs to the Daily Bugle helps but doesn't fully solve the problem, creating ongoing stress about money that adds to the other pressures of adjusting to college-level academic work while maintaining his responsibilities as Spider-Man. Aunt May insists on contributing what she can from her limited income, taking on additional part-time work that Peter wishes she wouldn't, because he can see the toll that the extra hours take on her aging body and her energy levels. The guilt that Peter feels about being a financial burden on his aunt, about pursuing his education while she works multiple jobs to help support him, creates motivation to increase his photography income by taking greater risks as Spider-Man and engineering more dramatic confrontations that will produce the kind of images that command premium rates from the Daily Bugle. The introduction of new people into Peter's life through his enrollment at Empire State University begins almost immediately. As the university's residential system and class structures force interaction with fellow students, in ways that Peter's isolation at Midtown High had allowed him to avoid. The freshman orientation programs and mandatory social events throw together young people from different backgrounds and create opportunities for connection and friendship that might not otherwise develop naturally. It's during one of these early orientation events, a mixer designed to help incoming students meet each other, that Peter first encounters the people who will become central to his college experience and his life during this crucial period of development and growth. Harry Osborn stands out in the crowd of incoming freshmen not because of his physical appearance, which is pleasant but unremarkable, but because of the quiet confidence that comes from a lifetime of wealth and social position, the unconscious assumption that he belongs in any space he occupies and that people will naturally be interested in knowing him. The Osborn name carries weight in New York business and social circles, associated with Oscorp Industries and the fortune that Norman Osborn has built through a combination of brilliance, ruthlessness, and strategic thinking. Harry has grown up in the shadow of his father's achievements and expectations, attending the best private schools and receiving advantages that money can provide. But there's something in his expression that suggests loneliness beneath the privilege, a desire for authentic connection with people who might see him as more than just an heir to a business empire. Peter's initial encounter with Harry happens almost by accident, a chance meeting during the orientation mixer when they both reach for the same refreshment at the same moment, and Harry makes a self-deprecating joke about his social awkwardness that surprises Peter by its apparent sincerity. The conversation that follows is tentative and slightly awkward. Two young men trying to figure out if they have anything in common beyond their incoming student status. But there's something appealing about Harry's lack of pretension and his apparent genuine interest in Peter's background and interests. When Harry learns that Peter is a science major who actually enjoys chemistry and physics, his reaction is one of bemused respect rather than the dismissive mockery that Peter encountered throughout high school, creating the first hint that college might offer opportunities for friendship that didn't exist in his previous educational experience. The development of friendship between Peter and Harry happens gradually over the first weeks of the semester, built on repeated interactions in shared classes and study sessions where Harry's natural generosity and Peter's genuine academic interest create complementary dynamics. Harry struggles with the science requirements that come easily to Peter, and Peter appreciates Harry's willingness to share resources and connections that make navigating university bureaucracy easier. The friendship that develops is genuine despite the vast differences in their backgrounds and resources, based on mutual respect and the simple, human need for connection with someone who seems to understand and accept you without judgment or ulterior motive. Harry's offers to pay for meals or provide rides in expensive cars create some discomfort for Peter, who is sensitive about accepting what feels like charity. But Harry's casual attitude about money and his clear lack of condescension make these gestures feel like simple expressions of friendship rather than reminders of economic inequality. Gwen Stacy enters Peter's awareness during the second week of classes when she raises her hand in their shared biology lecture to ask a question that reveals both deep understanding of the material and genuine intellectual curiosity about its implications. Peter notices her first for her intelligence, for the way she engages with the professor's explanations and pushes for clarification on points that most students would simply accept without examination. The physical attraction comes second, a growing awareness that this brilliant woman with her wheat blonde hair and her thoughtful blue eyes represents something that Peter has never really encountered before, someone who combines intellectual capability with natural warmth and an apparent lack of awareness of her own appeal. The attention that other male students pay to Gwen makes Peter assume that she's completely out of his league, that someone who looks like her and thinks like her would have no interest in an awkward scholarship student from Queens who spends his nights fighting crime instead of attending parties or building a normal social life. The first real conversation between Peter and Gwen happens in the biology laboratory, where they've been assigned as lab partners for the semester, paired together by the professor's alphabetical seating chart rather than by choice. Peter approaches the partnership with the expectation that he'll end up doing most of the work, while Gwen treats the class as a requirement to be endured rather than an opportunity to be embraced. But within the first lab session, it becomes clear that Gwen is as serious and capable as Peter himself. Someone who handles equipment with confidence and who understands experimental protocols with the kind of depth that suggests genuine scientific aptitude. The easy collaboration that develops between them during that first lab session creates a foundation for friendship that grows stronger with each subsequent meeting. As they discover shared interest in science and shared frustrations with the slower pace at which the introductory courses move compared to the advanced research they'd both prefer to be doing. Flash Thompson's presence at Empire State University on a football scholarship creates continuity with Peter's high school experience, while also highlighting how much both of them have changed and grown since those earlier days. The university environment doesn't eliminate Flash's tendency toward bullying and social dominance, but it moderates these behaviours somewhat as the more mature social expectations of college life make his high school tactics less effective and less tolerated. Flash still makes occasional comments at Peter's expense, and still carries himself with the athletic confidence that comes from being a star player on the football team, but the dynamic between them has shifted in subtle ways that neither of them fully acknowledges. Peter's enhanced abilities and his experience as Spider-Man have given him a quiet self-assurance that makes Flash's mockery bounce off harmlessly, while Flash himself seems slightly uncertain about how to relate to someone who no longer reacts with visible hurt or anger to his provocations. The complication that Flash's continued hero worship of Spider-Man creates in Peter's life becomes more pronounced in the college environment, where Flash has started a Spider-Man fan club that meets regularly to discuss the wall crawler's latest exploits and debate questions about his identity and motivations. Peter finds himself in the surreal position of listening to Flash defend Spider-Man against critics with the same passionate intensity that he uses to mock Peter Parker, completely unaware that he's simultaneously praising and tormenting the same person. The cognitive dissonance that this creates for Peter would be amusing if it weren't so frustrating. Another reminder of how his double life creates situations that would be impossible to explain or justify if the truth ever came to light. The academic challenges that Empire State University presents force Peter to re-evaluate his approach to education and time management, as the university-level coursework requires more sustained effort and deeper understanding than his high school classes ever demanded. The professors expect students to engage critically with material rather than simply memorizing facts, to conduct independent research and draw original conclusions, to contribute to discussions with insights that demonstrate genuine comprehension of complex concepts. Peter's natural intelligence and his scientific curiosity serve him well in this environment. But the time demands of his coursework conflict directly with his obligations as Spider-Man, creating the familiar tension between his two lives and forcing difficult choices about which responsibilities take priority at any given moment. The laboratory sessions that form a crucial component of Peter's science education provide opportunities to work with equipment and materials that he could never access otherwise, exposing him to techniques and technologies that advance his understanding of chemistry and physics in ways that prove immediately applicable to his work as Spider-Man. The knowledge he gains about polymer chemistry helps him improve his web fluid formula, creating variants with different properties for different tactical situations. The understanding he develops of material science and structural engineering allows him to better predict how buildings and bridges will respond to the forces generated by his web swinging, making him safer and more effective in his crime-fighting activities. The exposure to advanced biological concepts deepens his understanding of his own transformation and the ways that the spider bite altered his physiology at the cellular level. The social dimension of college life remains challenging for Peter, despite the friendships he's developing with Harry and Gwen, as his need to maintain his secret identity and his unpredictable schedule create barriers to full participation in the informal social networks that develop among students. The late-night study sessions and casual gatherings in dormitory common rooms happen at exactly the times when Spider-Man services are most needed, when criminals operate under cover of darkness, and when Peter's spider sense pulls him away from normal activities to respond to dangers that he cannot ignore. The pattern of making plans and then cancelling them, of showing interest in social activities and then disappearing without explanation, creates a reputation for flakiness and unreliability that Peter can do nothing to correct without revealing the truth about his double life. Gwen's growing interest in Peter manifests in ways that are subtle enough to create doubt about whether her attention represents romantic attraction or simple friendship, leaving Peter uncertain about how to respond without risking rejection or creating awkwardness that would poison their successful laboratory partnership. The conversations that extend beyond their lab work into more personal territory, the lingering glances that seem to carry meaning beyond simple eye contact, the way Gwen finds excuses to spend time with Peter outside of their scheduled class meetings, all suggest that her interest might go beyond professional collaboration or casual friendship. But Peter's experience with Betty Brant has taught him that his double life creates complications for romantic relationships, that his inability to be fully honest about his activities and his frequent unexplained absences create strains that can damage even genuine affection. The balancing act that Peter attempts during this first semester of college, trying to excel academically while maintaining his crime-fighting activities, while also building genuine friendships and potentially exploring romantic possibilities with Gwen, creates stress levels that would overwhelm someone without his enhanced physical resilience. The sleep deprivation becomes chronic and serious, with Peter averaging perhaps 4 or 5 hours of rest per night when his classmates are getting 7 or 8, relying on his enhanced metabolism and recovery abilities to keep functioning when normal human physiology would break down completely. The constant fatigue affects his mood and his judgment, making him more irritable and less patient with minor frustrations, creating a negative feedback loop where his exhaustion makes everything more difficult and the increased difficulty makes him more exhausted. Aunt May's reaction to Peter's transition to college life is complex and bittersweet, proud of his achievement and grateful for the opportunities he's pursuing, while also struggling with the emptiness of the house, now that he's gone for large portions of each day. The evening dinners that once provided regular connection and conversation become less frequent, as Peter's schedule fills with classes and study sessions and the crime-fighting activities that he can never explain. May notices that Peter seems tired and stressed, that he's losing weight despite his voracious appetite, that he sometimes seems distant and preoccupied when they do spend time together. Her attempts to talk with him about his well-being are gentle and concerned, coming from a place of love rather than judgment. But Peter deflects these conversations with reassurances that everything is fine, that he's just adjusting to the increased demands of college-level work, that she shouldn't worry about him when she has enough concerns of her own. The financial contribution that Peter continues to make to the household through his photography work becomes more important as the costs of his education accumulate, but also more difficult to sustain as the demands on his time increase and the opportunities to capture dramatic Spider-Man photographs become harder to engineer without compromising his effectiveness as a crime fighter. The dance between needing money and needing to actually stop crimes rather than simply photographing them creates moral compromises that trouble Peter's conscience, moments when he allows situations to develop longer than necessary for tactical reasons, because he knows the resulting images will command higher prices from the Daily Bugle. He tells himself that brief delays don't significantly increase the danger to innocent people, that capturing criminals 5 minutes later than he could have doesn't really matter in the larger scheme of things, but the rationalizations don't entirely eliminate the guilt he feels about prioritizing financial considerations alongside heroic obligations. The relationship between Peter and Betty Brant continues during this period, though it's strained by Peter's reduced availability and by the growing distance that college has created between their daily lives and experiences. Betty remains at the Daily Bugle while Peter navigates the university environment, creating separation not just of physical location, but of social context and daily concerns. When they do spend time together, the conversations sometimes feel forced or awkward, as if they're struggling to find common ground between Betty's work world and Peter's academic pursuits. The genuine affection between them persists, but it's complicated by unspoken questions about the future of their relationship, and by Peter's growing awareness that his feelings for Gwen Stacy might be developing into something that conflicts with his commitment to Betty. The web of connections and relationships and obligations that defines Peter's life during this first semester of college creates a complexity that feels overwhelming when he stops to consider it fully, so mostly he doesn't stop. He just keeps moving forward and responding to each demand as it arises, and trusting that somehow all of these pieces will fit together if he just works hard enough and cares enough and refuses to give up on any of his commitments. The boy who entered Empire State University hoping that college would be different from high school discovers that it is different in many ways, offering opportunities for genuine friendship and intellectual growth that were unavailable in his previous educational environment. But the fundamental challenge of living two lives remains unchanged, and perhaps even intensifies as the stakes grow higher and the relationships become more meaningful, and the potential costs of failure increase with each passing week. The evolution of Peter's relationship with Gwen Stacy from laboratory partners to genuine friends to something that feels like it might become romantic happens so gradually that neither of them can identify a specific moment when the transition occurred. The change emerging naturally from weeks of working together and talking together and discovering the pleasure of being understood by someone who seems to genuinely appreciate who you are rather than who they want you to be. Gwen's intelligence manifests not just in her academic performance, but in the thoughtful way she approaches problems, the careful attention she pays to understanding underlying principles, rather than simply memorizing procedures, the questions she asks that reveal curiosity about how things connect and what they mean beyond their immediate applications. The conversations that begin with discussions of class material gradually expand to encompass broader topics. Books they've read and ideas they find compelling, dreams about future careers and concerns about present challenges, the small revelations and confidences that build intimacy between people who are learning to trust each other. The physical attraction that Peter feels toward Gwen intensifies as their friendship deepens, though he tries to manage these feelings carefully given his ongoing relationship with Betty Brandt and his uncertainty about whether Gwen's warmth toward him represents romantic interest or simply the affection of a good friend. Gwen's appearance combines natural beauty with a complete lack of vanity or self-consciousness, as if she's genuinely unaware of the effect she has on the male students who watch her walk across campus or who compete for her attention in study groups and social settings. The wheat blonde hair that falls just past her shoulders catches sunlight in ways that make Peter's breath catch when he's supposed to be focusing on laboratory procedures. The blue eyes that meet his with such directness and apparent trust create a sense of connection that feels deeper than anything he experienced with Betty, though the comparison makes him feel guilty about the unfairness of judging one relationship against another. Gwen's family background provides her with advantages similar to Harry Osborne's, though the source and nature of the privilege differ significantly between them. Her father, Captain George Stacy, has built a distinguished career in the New York Police Department through dedication and competence, rather than inheritance or political connection. Rising through the ranks to a position of real authority and responsibility in the city's law enforcement hierarchy. The Stacy household reflects middle-class comfort rather than ostentatious wealth, a home where books line the walls and where dinner-table conversations revolve around ideas and current events rather than business deals or social positioning. Gwen's upbringing in this environment has given her a strong moral compass and a genuine concern for social justice, values that align closely with Peter's own beliefs, even if she doesn't know about his activities as Spider-Man. The first time Peter meets Captain George Stacy happens almost by accident when Gwen invites him to dinner at her family's home. Framing the invitation as a simple, friendly gesture among classmates, but creating a situation that carries undertones of something more significant, of presenting a potential romantic partner to a parent for evaluation and approval. Peter accepts the invitation with a mixture of excitement and nervousness, aware that meeting Gwen's father represents a step toward greater intimacy in their relationship, while also potentially exposing him to questions and scrutiny that could complicate his ability to maintain his secret identity. The preparation for this dinner occupies Peter's thoughts for days beforehand, worrying about what to wear and what to say and how to present himself as someone worthy of Gwen's attention and her father's respect. Captain Stacy proves to be a thoughtful and perceptive man whose decades of police work have given him the ability to read people with uncomfortable accuracy, to notice details that others miss, and to ask questions that probe beneath surface presentations to uncover deeper truths. His appearance is distinguished rather than imposing, grey hair and a weathered face that speaks to years of difficult decisions and witnessed tragedies, but his eyes carry a sharpness that suggests nothing escapes his attention and that deception would be difficult to maintain in his presence. The conversation over dinner ranges widely across topics of current events and social issues, with Captain Stacy drawing Peter out with questions about his background and his interests, his academic pursuits and his career aspirations, the kind of probing interview that might seem intrusive except for the genuine interest and respect with which Stacy conducts it. The moment that shifts the dinner from pleasant social occasion to something more significant comes when the conversation turns to the topic of Spider-Man, a subject that Peter cannot avoid given the web-slinger's prominence in New York news and Captain Stacy's professional involvement in law enforcement matters. Stacy's perspective on Spider-Man surprises Peter with its nuance and fairness, acknowledging both the legitimate concerns about vigilante justice and the practical reality that the masked hero has prevented crimes and saved lives in situations where conventional police response would have arrived too late or been insufficient to address superpowered threats. The captain speaks about Spider-Man with a respect and understanding that stands in stark contrast to J. Jonah Jameson's reflexive hostility, suggesting that someone with actual law enforcement experience recognizes the value of the wall crawler's contributions, even while maintaining appropriate concerns about accountability and legal authority. Peter listens to Captain Stacy's analysis of Spider-Man with careful attention, trying to maintain an expression of casual interest rather than the intense personal investment he actually feels, aware that Gwen is watching him and might notice if he reacts too strongly to her father's observations. Stacy's conclusion that Spider-Man appears to be motivated by genuine altruism rather than by desire for glory or financial gain, based on analysis of the hero's pattern of activities and the kinds of situations where he intervenes, provides Peter with validation from someone whose judgment he has reason to respect. The knowledge that this distinguished police captain, this man whose good opinion matters because of his position and his relationship to Gwen, views Spider-Man positively offers comfort that partially offsets the constant criticism Peter receives through Jameson's editorials and the suspicion he encounters from other segments of law enforcement. The walk home from the Stacy residence through the quiet evening streets gives Peter time to process the dinner and its implications, to think about how Gwen's invitation and her father's welcoming reception suggest possibilities for a relationship that goes beyond simple friendship or laboratory partnership. The connection he feels with Gwen has a quality of rightness and naturalness that his relationship with Betty never quite achieved, a sense that they understand each other on fundamental levels that don't require explanation or justification. The intellectual compatibility they share, the way they can challenge each other's thinking and push each other toward deeper understanding without competition or resentment, creates a foundation for intimacy that feels more substantial and more sustainable than the affection based primarily on physical attraction an emotional neediness that characterized his first romantic attachment. The complication that Betty Brant's continuing presence in Peter's life creates becomes more acute as his feelings for Gwen intensify, and as he begins to recognize that he cannot honestly maintain romantic relationships with both women simultaneously without betraying the trust of at least one of them. The visits to the Daily Bugle to deliver photographs and collect payment become increasingly uncomfortable, as Peter realizes that Betty's expectations for their relationship don't align with the direction his heart is pulling him, that the affection between them, while genuine, has been overtaken by his growing love for Gwen. The conversation that needs to happen about the future of their relationship gets postponed week after week, as Peter struggles with guilt about hurting someone who has been kind and supportive to him. Someone who doesn't deserve to be cast aside simply because someone else has captured his attention more completely. Gwen's growing awareness of Peter's divided attention and complicated personal life manifests in subtle questions and observations that suggest she's more perceptive about his situation than he's comfortable acknowledging. She asks about his work at the Daily Bugle, with interest that seems genuine rather than suspicious. Wanting to understand the photography that takes up so much of his time and creates the income that allows him to stay in school. She notices when he's distracted or preoccupied, when his attention drifts during conversations, or when he seems to be carrying burdens that he won't discuss, and her concern comes from a place of care rather than possessiveness. A desire to understand and support rather than to control or demand explanations. The gentleness with which she probes at the edges of his secrets, never pushing too hard or asking questions that would force him to lie directly, suggests that she suspects he's hiding something significant, but chooses to trust him rather than demanding transparency that might damage the relationship they're building. The development of romance between Peter and Gwen happens in small increments, rather than through dramatic declarations or grand gestures, built on shared experiences and growing trust and the accumulation of moments when they choose each other's company over other options. When they seek each other out for conversation or companionship, or simply the comfort of being near someone who makes the world feel less overwhelming. The first time they hold hands happens during a walk through the campus after a late study session, when the autumn chill makes Gwen shiver slightly and Peter offers his hand for warmth, and she takes it with a smile that suggests the gesture means more than simple physical comfort. The connection of palm to palm and fingers intertwined creates a circuit of intimacy that feels both thrilling and terrifying to Peter, who has limited experience with romantic gestures and whose life as Spider-Man has taught him that the people he cares about become targets for his enemies. The fear that loving Gwen puts her in danger becomes a constant undercurrent in Peter's experience of their developing relationship, creating anxiety that competes with the joy of being close to someone who seems to see and value his authentic self. The memory of Uncle Ben's death, caused indirectly by Peter's choices as Spider-Man, serves as a constant reminder that the people connected to him face risks that they don't choose and often don't even know exist. The possibility that someday a villain might discover Spider-Man's secret identity and target Gwen to hurt Peter, might use her as leverage, or might harm her simply to cause him pain, creates a moral dilemma about whether he has the right to pursue this relationship, knowing the potential consequences. But the alternative, isolating himself completely from human connection and emotional intimacy in the name of protecting others, seems like a different kind of death, a surrender to fear that would make his life as Spider-Man feel like a prison rather than a mission. The first kiss between Peter and Gwen happens on a December evening when early snow falls gently around them as they stand outside the library where they've just finished studying for final examinations. The moment emerges naturally from weeks of building tension and growing certainty, from the way they've been orbiting closer to each other emotionally and physically, from the recognition that what they feel has crossed the line from friendship into territory that requires acknowledgement. Gwen initiates the kiss with characteristic directness, rising on her toes to close the distance between them and pressing her lips to his with a gentleness that somehow combines confidence and vulnerability in ways that make Peter's heart race and his spider sense remain perfectly quiet. As if even his danger detection system recognizes that this particular risk is worth taking. The relationship that develops between them through the winter months of Peter's freshman year creates a center of warmth and stability in a life otherwise characterized by danger and deception, offering Peter glimpses of what normal happiness might feel like and what kind of future he might build if he can somehow find a way to balance his heroic obligations with his desire for personal connection. Gwen's presence in his life makes the exhaustion and the injuries and the constant pressure of living two existences feel more manageable, as if having someone to care about beyond himself. And Aunt May gives him additional motivation to survive his dangerous activities and to find ways to make all the pieces of his life fit together in sustainable patterns. The conversations they share range from light and playful to serious and searching, creating the kind of emotional intimacy that Peter has never experienced before, where he can discuss his dreams and fears without pretending to be someone he's not, even if he must carefully edit the specifics to avoid revealing his secret. The resolution of Peter's relationship with Betty Brandt happens with as much grace and mutual respect as such painful conversations ever achieve, when Peter finally finds the courage to tell her that his feelings have changed and that continuing their romance would be unfair to both of them. Betty receives the news with dignity and sadness, acknowledging that she had sensed his growing distance and had suspected that someone else had captured his heart even before he admitted it. The friendship that survives their romantic breakup is genuine, though tinged with the awkwardness that comes from caring about someone while knowing that the relationship cannot be what one of you wants it to be. Peter continues to bring his photographs to the Daily Bugle, and Betty continues to process them with professional efficiency. But the easy warmth between them has been replaced by careful politeness that makes Peter miss what they had even as he knows that ending it was the right choice. The holiday season during Peter's first year at Empire State University brings Gwen more fully into his family life. With invitations to join the Parker household for Christmas dinner and New Year's celebrations creating opportunities for Aunt May to know the young woman who's become so important to Peter. May's approval of Gwen is immediate and wholehearted, responding to the younger woman's genuine kindness and intelligence, her respectful attention to May's stories and her offers to help with cooking and cleaning in ways that speak to good upbringing and natural thoughtfulness. The domestic scene of the three of them together in the small house on Ingram Street, preparing meals and exchanging gifts and simply enjoying each other's company, provides Peter with a vision of what his life might look like if he can successfully maintain his double existence without tragedy destroying the relationships he values most. Captain Stacy's professional interest in Spider-Man creates situations where Peter must listen to detailed analyses of his own activities while maintaining the appearance of casual curiosity rather than personal investment. As Gwen's father shares observations and theories about the wall crawler's methods and motivations, Stacy's respect for Spider-Man's apparent moral code and his tactical effectiveness comes through clearly in these discussions, as does his professional concern about the legal and ethical complications created by vigilante justice operating outside official oversight. The captain's wish that Spider-Man would work more closely with police rather than operating independently reflects his law enforcement background, while his acknowledgement that the wall crawler has saved lives and prevented crimes that conventional police response could not have addressed, shows his pragmatic recognition of the value that superpowered individuals can provide when properly motivated. The depth of understanding that Captain Stacy demonstrates about Spider-Man's psychology and methods sometimes makes Peter wonder whether the experienced detective has deduced more than he lets on. Whether perhaps Stacy knows or suspects Peter's secret identity, but chooses not to confront him directly about it. The careful way that Stacy discusses Spider-Man when Peter is present, the slightly knowing tone in his voice when he talks about the wall crawler's apparent youth and moral seriousness, creates an undercurrent of possibility that Peter cannot quite dismiss, but also cannot openly acknowledge without potentially revealing everything. The ambiguity becomes another layer of complexity in Peter's relationship with Gwen and her family, creating situations where he must constantly monitor his reactions and guard his words to avoid accidentally confirming suspicions that may or may not actually exist. The academic performance that Peter manages during his first year at Empire State University, despite all the competing demands on his time and attention, demonstrates both his natural intelligence and his determination to succeed in all aspects of his life. The grades he earns are solid, if not spectacular, reflecting the reality that he cannot dedicate as much time to studying as his classmates who don't spend their nights fighting supervillains and their afternoons photographing their own heroic activities. His professors recognize his ability and his potential, while also noting that he seems distracted or exhausted in ways that prevent him from achieving the excellence that his entrance examination scores suggested he should reach easily. The pattern of promise not quite fulfilled becomes a familiar refrain in Peter's academic evaluations, a judgment that would sting more if he didn't know the reasons for his divided attention and the legitimacy of the other demands on his time. The summer between freshman and sophomore years brings changes to Peter's routine and relationships as the academic pressure temporarily eases, and he has more time to dedicate to his work as Spider-Man, while also deepening his connection with Gwen. The long days and warm evenings create opportunities for extended time together. For walks through the city and visits to museums and all the normal activities of young people falling in love while discovering their shared interests and compatible approaches to life. Gwen's summer work as a research assistant in a biology laboratory gives her insight into the professional scientific world that matches Peter's own interests and aspirations, creating another point of connection between them and another dimension to their conversations about future careers and contributions they hope to make to human knowledge and welfare. The happiness that Peter experiences during this period, the sense that his life might actually work despite its extraordinary complications, creates a foundation of hope and confidence that will sustain him through the darker times ahead. The love he shares with Gwen feels different from anything he experienced with Betty, deeper and more substantial, built on genuine understanding and compatible values rather than just affection and physical attraction. The acceptance he receives from Captain Stacy, whether or not it includes knowledge of his secret identity, provides a kind of paternal approval that fills part of the void left by Uncle Ben's death. The friendship with Harry Osborn offers companionship and social connection that make college life richer and more enjoyable than high school ever was. The web of relationships and responsibilities that defines Peter's existence during this period feels complex but manageable, as if he has finally found a sustainable balance between his heroic mission and his human needs for connection and intimacy. The exhaustion and the danger continue as constants in his life, but the presence of people who care about him and whom he cares about in return makes those burdens feel less crushing, transforming his motivation from guilt-driven obligation into something more positive, a desire to protect the world so that the people he loves can live safely in it. The boy who became Spider-Man out of guilt and shame has evolved into a young man who fights for love and hope, who understands that his powers exist not to punish himself but to serve others, who has learned that heroism requires not just courage and strength, but also the willingness to remain open to human connection, despite the risks that vulnerability brings. And so we drift gently back from our journey through Peter Parker's transformation, from invisible boy to wall-crawling hero, from someone defined by what others overlooked to someone who chose to define himself through service and sacrifice. The story we've explored together isn't really about spider bites or superpowers, but about the eternal truth that who we become depends not on what happens to us, but on how we choose to respond, that great power truly does come with great responsibility, and that the heaviest burdens become lighter when carried for love rather than guilt. Peter's journey from high school outcast to hero teaches us that the masks we wear, whether literal or figurative, matter less than the hearts that beat beneath them, that true strength comes not from enhanced abilities, but from the courage to remain open to connection despite the risks, that the double lives we all live in our own ways can be reconciled if we hold fast to our values and refuse to sacrifice our humanity on the altar of our obligations. As you drift into sleep, let Peter's story remind you that heroism isn't reserved for those with extraordinary gifts, that every act of kindness and every choice to help rather than to harm makes the world a little brighter, that we're all connected by invisible threads of responsibility and compassion that bind us into a web stronger than any spider's silk. The friendly neighbourhood hero swings on through the night, watching over dreamers like you, proof that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they choose love over fear, connection over isolation, and service over self. Rest now, true believer. Your own story of responsibility and hope continues tomorrow. Sweet dreams.